Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Brian Hansen. I'm Vice President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and I head up our research operations here. And I want to welcome all of you to this symposium, Revitalizing Industrial Regions in Europe and North America, an urgent item for the transatlantic agenda. It's great to have so many of you participating as we reached out to ask people and invite them to this discussion over the last 2 days. We were really thrilled that you have taken the time to be with us. We felt like we got exactly the kind of group gathered to have the discussion that we want to have. So thanks so much for being here. I want to start off our 2-day adventure with a few comments, setting up what it is that we hope to accomplish over the next couple of days and the context in which we're having this conversation. And of course, an event like this only happens with the support and help of terrific partners. And this symposium is no different. And I want to start off just by thanking our co-collaborators who've been so important to making this happen. First of all, John Austin, who is a non-resident fellow here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He also heads up the Michigan Economic Center and has been involved in regional fellow with the Brookings Institute as well. Another key partner in this process has been Jeff Anderson of Georgetown University. He's the former director of the BMW Center for German and European Studies, and the center too has been a great partner in working on this project. Our next partner is Andy Westwood from the University of Manchester, and I want to thank Andy for all of his contributions and the support of the University of Manchester in this project as well. And then really a very special thanks to Wolfgang Musinger, who is the general counsel, the German general counsel here in Chicago, who has been a really dedicated and key partner in putting this together, and also has helped facilitate financial support from the German Foreign Office that's been key in making this happen. And just a thanks for that support and to the German government for that support from the Science and Technology Fund. And I want to talk a little bit about, as we get going here, the genesis of this project. It really comes out of a combination of longstanding concerns, challenging new developments, an observation, and a hypothesis. And these are the things that we want to share with you over the next 2 days and also get your help thinking through. So first of all is the longstanding concern. And that is with the revitalization of old industrial regions, both in North America as well as in Europe. And for the Council, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, we're in the Midwest, what has been called the Rust Belt. And for over 2 decades, we've been focused on the issue of economic revitalization of this region in the context of globalization. And we have seen a differentiated pattern where some communities, the ones we hear about most perhaps, continue to struggle to find their footing in this world, while others are thriving. And we have done a number of studies and work in this area. John Austin and another colleague of mine at the council who's been instrumental in putting this event together, Alex Hitch, wrote a report about a little over a year ago on the Vital Midwest, laying out the pattern of regional change in this region. Also, Dick Longworth, a colleague at the council, wrote a key book called Caught in the Middle, describing this very phenomenon. Of course, this isn't only in the Midwest, but this is something that is being experienced in many parts of the world. So when we reached out to Jeff Anderson at Georgetown, who is a scholar of Germany and economic development, as well as more broadly in Europe, we talked about what he was seeing and the developments there. Andy Westwood at the University of Manchester, at Manchester University, has been focused on these issues within the UK. And of course, this has been an issue of great interest to our governments, including the German government that has worked on addressing these issues in many levels. So that's the longstanding concern. And with that has been joined a challenging new development. And specifically, that's the rise of populism and populist resentments against the status quo. And most concerning, those kinds of resentments that have led to a politics or a strand of politics that is undermining democracy and support for democracy. And with that also, and I think this is important in a transatlantic context, support for the Atlantic political order that is really delivered decades of political stability, global security, and economic opportunity. And as we were looking with this lens on regional economic development, and thinking through this rise of populism, we all simultaneously, all of our organizers, kind of simultaneously made an observation. And that is that one of the things that we thought we saw anecdotally was a relationship between the decline of old left behind industrial regions and the rise of populist resentment. Now, of course, this decline isn't the only source of populist resentment, and old industrial regions aren't the only areas where it's taking place. But what we did see, or thought we saw, was that populism was particularly pernicious in these historic manufacturing centers in Europe and North America that had experienced long-term decline. And we wanted to explore that more. And with that observation comes a hypothesis. And that is, if this long-term decline is related to support for populism, growing support for this kind of populism, then successful economic revival might be a viable strategy for both providing better outcomes for the people living in these regions, as well as part of a strategy for reversing this kind of populism in both North America as well as Europe. So this core group reached out to colleagues in Europe and started to have conversations about what they were seeing in places. And we reached out to our colleagues in Canada. And we started hearing stories of very similar kinds of phenomenon. So out of those conversations was birthed the idea for this symposium, which was essentially to take the conversations that we'd been having and the writing that we had started to do on this and enlarge the conversation in order to benefit from you all, to bring you all into this conversation and help us get a better sense of what you're seeing, as well as what you are doing in order to be able to drive the kind of revitalization that we hope for these regions, and the linkage to politics and the linkage to voting patterns and political expression in your communities. So this symposium is not one of these events where we have all the answers all sewn up and we're just going to present you all the knowledge that there is to be had. Instead, what it is very intentionally is designed to be a discussion. And we are very grateful to have with us a really illustrious group of people to help us share their experiences, their ideas, and to use that to really stimulate our discussion over the next couple of days. And not only do we want to gather these experiences and learnings from North Americans and Europeans, but we want to also have this event be a catalyst to building a network, pulling people together who have similar interests, who have similar motivations and want to have an impact on these challenges of revitalizing these regions, as well as creating a more stable and productive politics on both sides of the Atlantic. So we invite you in not only for today and tomorrow's discussions, but hopefully into an ongoing process of discussion and work to actually create change. So going beyond just simply talking about these issues and acting in order to create change. The other thing that I want to note about who is assembled here is that we were very intentional to bring together a set of folks that oftentimes can end up talking in silos. And that is academics, uh, practitioners and policy people, as well as politicians. And to be able to have a conversation across these groups of people to hopefully help inform our own thinking, our own understanding of what's going on in the world. So for each day, we're going to have very few things like this where somebody is going to just talk at you for 15 minutes nonstop. As a matter of fact, I think this is about the only time that's going to happen, because what we want to do is really drive discussion. And we are very fortunate, as I mentioned, to have people who are going to help us frame, think about, put ideas on the table, put experiences on the table, and help us stimulate the kind of discussion that we want to have with you. There will be a combination of talks, keynote addresses. Sometimes there will be questions and answers for keynotes. There will be panels. All of this is meant really to drive discussion. So I encourage you to, as you listen, to be also think about what you have to contribute to this conversation and bring them together. Today, we're going to focus on a couple of key issues. One is we'll have a panel that digs into the connections between populism and place, and then a roundtable of distinguished mayors that bring their perspectives from the US, UK, and Canada, as well as other really important interventions. Tomorrow, the panels tomorrow are going to highlight community success stories with practitioners and elected officials that highlight the ways in which communities can address structural economic change. All right, so that's what we're about. Again, thank you for being here. I've got a couple of housekeeping remarks before we dive into the content for today. First of all, this conversation is on the record and it's being recorded. We're going to post this conversation on a website that will be hosted at the council to be able to facilitate and make accessible this conversation and facilitate the use by others who are addressing these challenges in their relevant domain. At this point, people are well used to the Zoom world, sadly. So I'll ask you, as you're probably used to doing, please silence your audio unless you're participating in the discussions and Q&A, in which case you'll probably be reminded to unmute yourself. Certainly I will. I want to note that it is a very intense schedule, but we do have a break built in about halfway through. And then finally, after the formal kind of plenary events take place, we are going to have informal breakout rooms and an opportunity for folks to talk to one another and meet one another directly. So I hope you'll stay around for that after we're done. So that's the game plan. Again, really appreciate you being here. And in order to kind of start our first day of activities, we've got some folks who are going to set our context for us. And these are people who come out of the political realm and the government realm to be able to help us get a sense of why these issues are so important and why the kind of exploration, the kind of work that we're going to engage in here in the next 2 days and then more broadly is so important. And to kick us off, we're really thrilled to have with us Ambassador Emily Haber, who is the German ambassador to the United States, a post she has had since June of 2018. And prior to arriving in Washington, D.C., she served in various leadership functions in the Foreign Office in Berlin and really been a path breaker with her career. In 2009, she was appointed political director, and in 2011, Secretary of State, and the first woman who held either of those posts in Germany. Thereafter, she's been deployed also, interesting for this conversation, to the Federal Ministry of the Interior, serving as State Secretary in charge of Homeland Security and Migration Policy from 2014 to 2018. She has, in addition, a very long and distinguished diplomatic career serving in many other places. But I want to welcome Ambassador Haber to this meeting and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Brian Hansen, and good morning, everybody. I really think this is a great format. 6 different countries, different stakeholders, different perspectives, each with different examples and solutions to the same challenge, to wit, what are the consequences of structural change and how can this challenge be turned into a success? It's important to address the topic of structural change. We all face it in various forms. First of all, in every country, regions are different, both in terms of their economic structure and the environment they offer for growth. The objective is to find ways of compensating for the economic disadvantages that some regions incur, and to create a situation where the standard of living is equally high across all regions. Areas like the American Rust Belt or parts of Eastern Germany or the Ruhr Valley face similar problems and are undergoing significant structural change. They need to manage the transformation from traditional industries to modern industries with all the challenges this entails. Qualification of the workforce, technological change, for example. But there are also structural changes that affect our countries as a whole, to wit, how to cope with climate change, the digitization of business and society. In both cases, relevant actors need a long-term strategy to ensure prosperity for tomorrow. But, and this is equally important, they also need strategies to communicate and explain the reasons for the changes, as well as the equitable character of the solutions proposed in order to secure and maintain public support. And you've explained the reason why this is so necessary. The communication aspect is sometimes more time-consuming and more difficult than developing the economic solutions. Managing structural change economically, but also politically, is a challenge that affects both sides of the Atlantic, and therefore it makes fundamental sense to treat it as a transatlantic issue, to exchange views, experiences, vantage points about the challenges and the possible solutions, and to learn from each other. And this is precisely what you're doing today, and I want to commend you for that. But before you retreat to discuss structural change and share best practices, let me say a few words on the overall state of play of our transatlantic relations. We welcome that President Biden has voiced his support for intensifying cooperation with allies, and that he has emphasized the importance of the multilateral system. We look forward to working with the new administration, and we hope that this will be an opportunity for a fresh start and to strengthen transatlantic economic relationship. However, it bears noting that before we can start to work together, we need to resolve our existing trade tensions, especially the unjustified Section 232 steel and aluminium restriction placed on European exports. Under the Section 232 provision, European exports are regarded as a threat to the national security of the United States, even though Europe has been a close security and NATO ally of the US for decades. This obvious inconsistency clearly runs counter to close transatlantic cooperation. So our first priority should be to resolve bilateral trade irritants through negotiated solutions. The 4-month suspension of all retaliatory tariffs of on EU and US exports imposed in the Airbus and Boeing dispute was an important first step. It was a good start for our new and positive agenda. And we hope a similar solution can be found on the Section 232 steel and aluminium tariffs, and so that we can move on to shape a post-pandemic world together, based on our common values, on our shared interests, and our global influence. Our combined global power and influence remains unrivaled. In my view, this combined power and influence is indispensable to address pressing issues like structural change together. Indeed, there are multiple areas where we can engage in renewed transatlantic cooperation. The EU has set out its ideas on an EU-US agenda for global change at the end of the last year. It goes well beyond trade issues, and it focuses on areas where our interests and values converge and where we can best exercise our collective leverage. Trade can and should play its part as a powerful enabler, contributing to making progress on the big challenges we confront. To it, together, we should lead reform of the World Trade Organization. We should facilitate trade in essential medical and healthcare products, and we should work together towards a competitive, inclusive, circular green economy, including a WTO trade and climate initiative and measures to avoid carbon leakage. The Biden administration offers new prospects to cooperate closely on green transformation of our economies, and we strongly support this, as we support the aims and targets of the Paris Agreement. We are engaged in many efforts to achieve these goals in Germany and in Europe. We welcome that the US has returned to the Paris Agreement, and we welcome the strong engagement in fighting climate change. The political challenge for climate policy is to define a new model of sustainable economic growth, which promotes technical innovation and behavioral change in a way that is socially and economically acceptable and balanced. To achieve our climate policy goals on a global scale, we believe that by bringing its huge potential, technological capabilities, and creativity to the table, the US can advance these efforts significantly. We are ready to cooperate with the US federal and state governments, municipalities, local communities, civil society, and NGOs in this endeavor. And we believe that transatlantic cooperation is indispensable to achieve a global solution. The Transatlantic Climate Bridge is an example where we already exchange experiences, identify common challenges, and discuss innovative solutions with federal, sub-federal, public, and private actors on the structural changes necessary to tackle climate change. When it comes to digitization, we see manifold opportunities to work together on technology, on trade, on standards. Like the US, Europe and Germany are discussing the future role of the democratically legitimized state in the face of a growing concentration of power in the hands of a few select companies. We want to enter into a dialogue on these issues, and we want to do this on the basis of our common values. Our shared values of human dignity, individual rights, and democratic principles make us natural partners in harnessing rapid technological change and facing the challenges of rival systems of digital governance. We should join forces as tech allies to shape technologies, their use, and their regulatory environment. The proposed EU-US Trade and Technology Council seems to be a good format to address these issues. But cooperation does not always have to be high level. It starts with conferences like this one. There are many examples of existing cooperation on important issues. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the German program for transatlantic encounters. Through this program, financial support is given to German-American cultural, educational, scientific, and business projects seeking to foster exchange and encourage human encounters. Many projects focus on common issues and explore cooperation at the state, county, or even city level. For cities, it is often easier to experiment with innovative approaches that can be replicated, as well as scaled up to the state or national level. And this is why we are currently planning a project in cooperation with the German Marshall Fund. Over the next 2 years, teams of cross-sector stakeholders from about a dozen cities in the US and in Europe will examine the innovative practices and policies they have developed to strengthen democratic institutions and core values within their cities. Prospective participants in the cross-sector teams will include mayors, elected and appointed city leaders, officials, and professionals responsible for innovation, electoral procedures, public safety and justice, public participation and education, local media, and civil society leaders. In my view, it is in these formats that we can learn most from each other and tackle common challenges. And your symposium is a perfect example of the transatlantic cooperation we need. I'm sure you're going to have many interesting and fascinating discussions over the course of the next 2 days. Thank you and all the best.
Ambassador Haber, I want to thank you so much. I couldn't have asked for a better setup of our discussion over the next 2 days. You really framed this issue so beautifully and powerfully in terms of its transatlantic dimensions and its importance inside a broad-ranging set of issues that are part of the transatlantic relationship that affect what's going on the ground. So I thank you very much for your comments, for taking the time to be with us, and for the cooperation of your government in helping make this happen. Thanks very much. And next, we have with us a perspective to help get us going from the United States. We are going to hear from Senator Gary Peters. Senator Peters represents the state of Michigan, which many people know from the US auto industry, but also a very important state in many industrial areas. Senator Peters has been in the Senate since 2015, and he's really focused a great deal of energy on economic revitalization, particularly in the context of a state that has gone through the challenges that we talked about earlier. He's been interested in strengthening the economy, providing good paying jobs, affordable healthcare, secure retirement, and economic opportunity for his state and for the United States. He is the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committees, which oversees the Department of Homeland Security and also the Senate's top oversight committee. He also serves on the Armed Services Committee, the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, which pertains very much to what we're doing here in this. And he previously served in the House of Representatives beginning in 2008. Welcome, Senator Peters.
Hello, I'm U.S. Senator Gary Peters, and I'd like to thank the entire team at the Council on Global Affairs for hosting this critical discussion. Whenever I'm asked about the long-term economic outlook for my home state, I always say that the future is bright, because all across Michigan, from Dearborn to Marquette, making things is simply in our DNA. That is why, since the onset of this pandemic, our businesses and workers have proven central to protecting our communities and bolstering economic recovery efforts. While shifting operations and maintaining staff has been extremely difficult, I am proud of all of the efforts Michiganders have undertaken to help us navigate this unprecedented public health and economic crisis. And I know that around the United States, we have seen similar efforts. There is no question that as the United States and our allies and strategic partners confront divisive geopolitical forces, it is critical that we respond by utilizing the hard-earned lessons from the COVID crisis to accelerate economic opportunity in our industrial regions. That is why I'm continuing my efforts in the United States Senate to focused federal policy on manufacturing, and streamlining existing national efforts to better promote a coordinated strategy. I have also authored and enacted bipartisan measures to expand apprenticeships and vocational training opportunities so that more Americans can fill good-paying job openings and help build the products of tomorrow. Forging more inclusive, sustainable economic growth has never been more important. We must work together as allies in economic recovery and to advance our shared values and interests. Thank you, and I look forward to working with all of you in the years ahead.
Thank you for that. Excuse me. Thank you for that message, Senator Peters. In keeping with the theme of kind of opening up our discussion with perspectives from different countries, the next speaker that we have with us, we're very pleased to have Lisa Nandy with us. Lisa is a member of parliament in the UK, representing Wigan since 2010, and notably, she serves as Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. During her time in parliament, Lisa has served in the front bench on a number of different roles, including Shadow Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, Shadow Children's Minister, and Shadow Minister of Civil Society. Notably, and connected to Ambassador Haber's comments, Lisa is also the co-founder of the think tank Center for Towns, which was set up to ensure equal attention be given to the viability and prosperity of British towns. Lisa, welcome so much. It's great to have you here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for those incredible contributions to kick us today. The world has experienced huge waves of global upheaval in recent years. In the United Kingdom, in particular, the vote to leave the European Union sent shockwaves through the political establishment, while over in the United States, the same year election and then later tenure of President Trump had major implications, not just in the United States, but in the world. What did those two events have in common? Well, they revealed divisions on display between cities, who on our side of the Atlantic voted to remain, whilst over in the US voted heavily for Hillary Clinton, and between more rural areas outside, which voted strongly to leave in the EU debate, and where over in the United States, where fewer than 100,000 votes switching hands in rural parts of swing seats decided the outcome of the presidential election. Those divisions that it exposed here in the UK is something that the academic Will Jennings went on to describe as two Englands with very different priorities and outlooks, one that believes that the future would be better than the past, the other that believed that the past was better than the future. When you dig beneath the surface, what did we learn? Well, this was a story of ageing. Between 1981 and 2011, as the Centre for Towns has shown, towns and villages across the UK lost over 1 million people under the age of 25, whilst the population amongst over 65 was boosted by 2 million. In contrast, our core cities gained over 300,000 for 25s and lost close to 200,000 over 65s. This is what has been described as the sorting effect. In the United States, it's known as the big sort. In France, it's described as the halo effect. In Britain, it has aged our towns and villages, whilst our cities have been much, much younger. And this loss of working age population, which lies behind it, have profound implications. It's left those towns and villages at the sharp end of the social care crisis and given us a crisis of loneliness as people grow old, living hundreds of miles away from children and grandchildren. It's cost us those institutions that are the very fabric of our communities, the theatres, the social clubs, that as a colleague of mine, Jessie Norman MP, once said, shape and define us as we help to shape and define them. The loss of spending power is also visible on our board-up high streets, in our cancelled bus networks that are no longer sustainable because of falling passenger numbers. Now, the seeds of this were sown many years ago with an uncritical embrace of economic globalisation in the 1980s, a model that hands so much power to capital that by the late 1990s, it had convinced the then Labour government that this model of globalisation was not a choice but a fate. It ushered in an era of flexible labour markets and deregulation to, as the Minister at the time, Tony Blair, put it, untie the hands of business, described in a famous speech in Chicago known as the Chicago speech. And in a sink-or-swim world, those who were not swift to adapt, slow to complain, open, willing and able to change, and put it, found themselves on the wrong side of history. And this is how places like Jackson, Kentucky, which was made memorable to millions through J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, and Wigan in Lancashire, which is known globally for George Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, came to be stripped of their vitality, their purpose, their inheritance, seen no longer as contributors, but as the problem itself. Their wages too high, their demands too many, so the story went. And so the work was transferred to countries where this problem was removed, and the dignity of labour became a private, not a political concern, questions of ethics handed to the market to decide. Less than 2 decades later, on both sides of the Atlantic, the people in those places delivered their verdict on that approach. So what is to be done? Well, the debate in the UK has centred very much around the deficits in these areas, often described as left behind communities. And it is true that 40 years of economic decline has hard. But in order to turn this around, the debate has to refocus on the assets and the potential in those places. Take my town in Wigan, which within living memory powered the world through the dangerous, difficult work that we did in the mining industry. This is how Britain's wealth and global influence was built, and we are proud of that legacy. But those engineering skills still exist in Wigan, but now they're mostly used to teach people who travel from across the world to study at the local college. Think what could be done with the right investment in new clean energy technology. Why shouldn't young people in those communities power us through the next century, just as their parents and grandparents powered us through the last? Now, that investment will rely on better decisions about infrastructure, the digital and transport infrastructure that businesses need to thrive. Those decisions are currently made by a group of men, and it is always men, behind the desk in Westminster, far too remote from the reality of people's lives, and it's left our regions chronically underfunded. And I'm hearing from Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, later today. It's no accident that it's our mayors like Andy who are pressing forward with the real change that's needed to address the economic decline of recent decades. It's only with meaningful devolution that we'll get the resources into the places that most need it. But just as we need local action, we need global action too. Our relationship with China is far more central to the factory operative earning the minimum wage in a factory in Stockton than any high street grant. Recently, we've had a scandal emerging here in the United Kingdom. Our former Prime Minister, David Cameron, giving evidence today to MPs about a grubby affair that has emerged around a company called Greenshill Capital, which was able to get access to the heart of government. What that has exposed is the cosy financial relationship between politics and finance, a system which allows a chosen few with unparalleled access to power to milk the system until it breaks, taking risks, happy in the knowledge that if they win big, but if they lose, it is never them, but people in towns like Rotherham and Hartlepool, the Liberty Steel workers whose industry has collapsed as a consequence of those dodgy deals, who shoulder the appalling losses. Now, in the UK, we've focused a lot on the how to deal with the question of China, and particularly about the Chinese political model and the worry that that model becomes more dominant. But we've paid far too little attention to the consequence of China's economic model for the British people, a model which relies on low working standards, poor wages and unfair trade practices to drive growth. British companies have some of the weakest protections in the world against practices like social dumping or the use of slave labour or unacceptable practices. So to really address the problem for those areas, we've got to set about build trade policy fit for the 21st century that prioritises fairness as well as market access, that protects the environment, that champions labour rights from towns like Bolton to Bangalore. And we must clean up the dirty money that flows through the City of London, that sanes those authoritarian regimes, close tax loopholes and bear down on tax havens. The UK in particular has an outsized responsibility for this, given the dominance of the City of London. We are really interested in the agenda that is emerging from the United States, led by Joe Biden, particularly over issues like the push for a global minimum corporation tax that will stop money leaking out of the areas where it could be used to rebuild our communities from the ground up. These are measures that we have to take in order to turn around 4 decades now of economic decline and start to restore hope in those communities. This is how you build a country at ease with itself, that knows what it is for, that can deliver on our needs at home, and has the confidence to stand for them overseas, that invests in people and puts them at the centre of a vision for the country, because in the end, it's from them that power is derived, and it is to them that power must return. As one of the great British Foreign Secretaries, Ernest Bevin, once put it, after all thought you can give to it, the only repository of faith, he said, that I've been able to find is the common people. That is what must underpin our approach, not just to domestic policy, but to foreign policy as well. For so many people, for so long in these communities, people have wished, longed to see hope flickering back life. This is what George Orwell called the England that lies beneath the surface, and it must be heard.
Terrific, Lisa. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing those comments. Again, really a powerful way to frame the importance of this project, and really appreciate all your work and contributions in this area as well. Thank you. So next, we want to move from these framing, really important framing comments that we've heard into our first example of work that's being done on the ground in an important old industrial region in order to try to create a better future. And specifically, we're going to look at the Ruhr Conference, which has launched over 70 projects to revitalize the economy, create increased dynamism, and improve the quality of life of people in the Ruhr region, which, as most folks know, and Ambassador Haber mentioned, is a historic center of heavy industry in Germany. We're going to start with a short video to introduce all of you to the Ruhr Conference and the work that has been done there. After that video, we're going to hear from Mark Speich, who has been instrumental in that effort. Let me tell you a little bit about Mark. He is the State Secretary for Federal, European, and International Affairs of the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia. He is also the plenipotentiary to the federal government. And prior to this, he has served as CEO of the Vodafone Germany Foundation and the Vodafone Institute for Society and Communications, as director of the policy planning staff of the CDU-CSU parliamentary party in the German Bundestag, as well as the director of the Herbert Quandt Foundation. So we will first hear the video. Little bit of an opportunity to talk about this initiative. So if you've got specific questions about it, we'll have a chance to ask those as well. I am very happy to say that we've got with us Mr. Jürgen Hein, who has been intimately involved with the Ruhr Conference activities. And if I could ask him, Jürgen, if you don't mind sharing with us, with apologies for no advance warning here, but share with us some of the experience of the Ruhr Conference. And then also we probably have time to take a question or two about it as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Brian. I hope you're hearing me. Yeah, it's a bit of a surprise. Maybe we can listen to the to Mark Speich later on or tomorrow if you get the video going. I think talking about the Ruhr Conference, there are three main points I want to make. The first one is we see it as a big change project. As you said, something has happened in the minds of people by what happened to their regions. And that view onto their own regions has to be turned around. So that's why we're talking about the Chancenregion, the region of opportunities. We want to get away from the deficit perspective and towards the perspective of opportunities. And for that, and that's the second thing, we were sure it's not a good idea to have a one-day donators conference. We had these in the Ruhr area because we had two main crises. One was about the coal, which was getting more and more expensive, and it was not economical to get it out of the ground again. And that was in '79, and that was the first crisis conference because we, from 600,000 jobs in the coal mining, we've come down to just about zero by now. And that started in the '70s, and we needed this conference then. Second was in '88, because that was the steel crisis with the competition from all over the world. And we were saying, yes, that was correct to do at that time, answering to crises. But now we don't have a crisis. There's nothing bad happening. Actually, the Ruhrgebiet is on a good way. But this constant repeating of the troubles that it was facing as a turnaround region, we needed to do something about that perspective. And that cannot be done in a one-day conference. So we said we need a process to start. So that, in that sense, the Ruhr Conference is what the word actually means. People come together, and not only for once, but over the next couple of years. It started 3 years ago, and it will go on. And the third thing I want to mention is that, are you still seeing me? I mean, I'm losing the picture now. I'll just go on talking until you stop me, Brian.
Please go ahead.
Okay, the third thing that seemed important to us was it's not about economy only, to quote Clinton in a different way. It's economy, yes, but if you want to have a bright perspective for a whole region, the story has to go beyond economy. If we want to convince the bright brains who are being educated at the Ruhr universities to stay, if we want to convince the bright brains to come from all over the world, then they would be asking immediately, where will our kids go to school? Where will they get their education? Where will I go in the evening if I want to see a concert? Where will I go on Sunday if I want to see a museum? So all that is there. But the idea was that if we talk about the museum and the concert hall in one of the cities only, I know my friend Martin van der Putten is here, so I'm not mentioning certain cities, then that effect is not as strong as if we are telling about the story and the opportunities of the whole region. Anyway, if we, I mean, you are one of the examples, maybe most of us here in this group are the examples. If we are talking about the Ruhrgebiet, you know what we are talking about. If I mention to you certain cities, you might not. So the third point that we're making is let's spread into all areas of life. We have actually 5 fields where these 73 projects are being put into practice right now. And let's try to get the additional benefit out of working together and networking. So that spontaneously is the Ruhr Conference in a nutshell. Anytime 3 hours more, but I'll stop it here. Thank you.
Terrific. And there is a fabulous website which outlines some of those projects as well. I'm told by my technical people that we should have Mark Speich's comments now. So let me see if we can to slip that in. Jürgen, thank you so much for jumping in and providing that context for us in the meantime.
Dear Ambassador, dear Emily Haber, dear Senator Peters, dear organizers, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your invitation. It is with great pleasure that I provide some introductory remarks at this symposium and introduce the so-called Ruhr Conference, a process to advance the structural transformation in North Rhine-Westphalia and more specifically the Ruhr region. Talking about revitalizing industrial regions always means talking about structural transformation, a process that entails necessary economic change, but also societal and cultural adaptation. It also means talking politics. Unfortunately, it often means talking about polarization and populism. Europe and America have both experienced industrial change that has profoundly altered many parts of the United States, as well as our Ruhr region in Germany, the Basque Country, Wales, Lorraine, or other parts of Europe. In the last decades, these regions that were once forerunners of the Industrial Revolution, carried by coal, iron, and steel, faced substantive challenges. In the last decades, these regions have had a decisive role in the reconstruction of Western Germany. The Ruhr region was the powerhouse that rebuilt Germany's economy, creating the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle after the war. Then, as early as the 1960s, this was starting to change. To extract coal from ever deeper layers became not profitable anymore. International price cutting affected local steel production. In mining alone, 600,000 jobs were lost within a few decades. And our last Ruhr region coal mine closed in 2018. An engine for innovation and industrialization for so many years, much like Michigan and Pennsylvania, the Ruhr region was battling closure of pits, unemployment, and even social unrest. First, the Ruhr region tried to save and preserve its old industrial structure. But we have learned that it is necessary to develop new sectors to compensate for the losses. It is necessary to diversify and to attract new industries. And we have also learned that it is essential to adapt and build on the existing structures rather than try to radically change. Despite all efforts, decline was long more present in the public eye than progress was. That had to change. Revitalizing a region must mean advancing the quality of life in this region, not only its industry. Take the people on this journey to prevent social unrest. And there was eagerness to rebuild, the will to adapt and to change. Nowadays, I'm glad that we have great examples of future-oriented branches that emerged from the old industrial tradition. Those examples come from the field of energy supply, such as green steel, from solar or medical technology. You will find other examples of this transformation all over the region. Old industrial monuments, such as Zeche Zollverein in Essen, once the biggest coal mining plant in the country. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, an incredibly attractive touristic spot both for the local community and for foreign tourists to enjoy. It is nowadays also a creative hub for startups and home to a very important design award that is internationally acclaimed. To link economic change in the region to its society and its culture is essential. As you have seen in the video, the Ruhr Conference is a process that started 3 years ago following the motto, "It is the people who shape the metropolis." This motto is the foundation of the conference. The people are formative for the region. It is their initiative and their confidence that is needed to transform successfully. And our process at the conference follows 3 phases: listening to the people, making decisions, and implementing them. The conference aims at bringing together citizens and institutions with the local government in town hall meetings, project-specific formats, and via an online platform. We had 20 theme-based forums, which developed into more than 75 projects on issues of common relevance across the whole region. They are looking for the next level in the regional development across a variety of sectors: business, science, sports, culture, or tourism. I would like to introduce you to some of our projects. First, joint research. The most important researchers of 3 universities in the rural region will join forces and cooperate in 5 new joint research departments across the universities. Second, green infrastructure. The fight against climate change is essential, and it is reflected in the Ruhr Conference Green Infrastructure Project. All Ruhr cities are tackling one issue together, discussing how they network their green spaces, how they ventilate their streets and residential areas, and how they green their roofs. Third, security. Our Ruhr Conference project is dedicated to the topic of security in inner cities. It is directed at the cities of the region as well as various responsible authorities in the Ruhr that are cooperating and that are joining forces to fight organized crime. Fourth, young media. Young people from different social backgrounds work together on media projects such as podcasts or radio shows, including political issues relevant for their neighborhoods. This way, young people in the rural region have a voice while gaining media skills valuable for forward-looking social dialogue. And finally, new arts. The Ruhr Conference's ambitious culture project aims to make the rural region the home of new arts. All of the projects were developed together with the people of the region. In the 53 cities, towns, and villages, and in debate with foundations, universities, companies, and civil society networks. What we have learned again in this process, change always entails changing mindsets. A region in transition needs to be aware of its strength. It must have a plan to leverage synergies. For the ongoing Ruhr Conference, this means the Ruhr region continues its progress towards an economically successful and livable metropolis. It is a process that takes time. Quick wins will not generate substantive and deep change. Structural transformation is not a self-reinforcing process, not one triggered solely by economic forces. It needs societal and cultural adaptation and, as well, political courage. And it needs dialogue and exchange within the region and beyond. For instance, with our friends and partners in America and Europe, like at this symposium with you. I wish you an insightful and successful conference, and I'm looking forward to your discussion and your output. Thank you very much.
Great. I'm so glad we were able to get those comments there because they framed very nicely so many of the issues that we're going to be dealing with in the next couple of days, and particularly appreciated that connection of the economic and the cultural and a focus on the people who live in the region as being a key to the development. The next piece for us is our first panel, and our panels are intended to drive discussion. So there's an opportunity coming for you all to join our discussion so far. And this panel will be about the issue of populism and place. So let me introduce my colleague, co-organizer, of this event today, Jeff Anderson, who's going to head up this panel. Jeff is a professor in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government at Georgetown University. And from 2002 to 2018, he served as the Graf Goltz Professor and Director of the BMW Center for German and European Studies in the Walsh School there at Georgetown. And he's published widely on comparative political economy with a focus on European integration, German politics, and regionalism. Jeff, I look forward to our panel. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Brian. And it's an honor to be here, and it's certainly a great privilege to moderate this panel with four stellar colleagues, each of whom is doing really interesting and innovative work on populism and its many manifestations. I want to just jump right into it. So at the risk of doing skeletal introductions that do not do justice to the contributions and publication records of these four colleagues, what I'm going to do is just pop these links to their bios, and I really encourage you to go and see what these colleagues have done and are doing in this area of an important area of research. We're going to start with Professor Kaz Mudde, who is the Stanley Wade Shelton UGAF Professor in the Department of International Affairs at the University of Georgia. Professor Mudde is a leading scholar of populism, the author of numerous books and articles on the subject dating back a couple of decades, including more recently The Far Right Today and also The Far Right in America. And I can think of no one better positioned to give us the big picture, particularly the post-2008, the post-financial crisis epoch that we're in, this populist moment. What distinguishes it from past episodes of populism around the world, and what are the specific challenges that it's posing to the democratic order both at home and abroad. Kaz, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thanks everyone for having me here. I will do for what is for academics a very short time. I will hope to give a relatively quick introduction to the topic. So first of all, one has to give some type of definition of populism so that it's clear what I'm talking about. Now, obviously, there is no universal consensus on it, but increasingly more and more people work with what is called the ideational approach, which sees populism as a set of ideas. Now, whether it constitutes an ideology, as I argue, or more a discourse like others argue, there's some debate about it, but most people have definitions of populism that come close to what I will now read out as my definition, which is populism is an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, the general will of the people. So populism is about monism and moralism. The key distinction is about morality. It's the pure people versus the corrupt elite. And populism can be left-wing and right-wing. It can also be idiosyncratic, like the Five-Star Movement in Italy. I think what sets the current wave apart, if you can speak about a wave of populism, is that first of all, it's much more widespread. Populism is old, and to a certain extent, people mostly argue that it emerged in the mid-19th century. But outside of particularly Latin America and the United States, it's never been particularly relevant. And it's become much more acceptable and much wider spread, including in Europe. I would say since the 1980s, 1990s, it got a boost by the Great Recession. I would see the Great Recession as a catalyst rather than a cause. It was around, but it got a boost. Also, in the early 21st century, populism came both from the left and the right. Think about, for example, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and Morales in Bolivia. Think about Podemos in Spain and Syriza in Greece. That left-wing populist moment has kind of disappeared. It's doubtful whether it left a major impact on Europe. Obviously, it had a major impact on Latin America. And it had some impact here in the US with Occupy Wall Street, which kind of then gave way to the whole Sanders movement. But if you look at the populist moment now and really about the last 5 to 10 years, it is very much a radical right populist moment. Almost all of the key populist actors of today are on the right and are on the far right. Think about Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, and others. And here it's a combination of populism and particularly nativism, which is a xenophobic form of nationalism. Now, what does it do? And particularly, what does it do to democracy? So let me distinguish democracy from liberal democracy. Democracy in itself is a narrow system of popular sovereignty and majority rule. To keep it very simple, it means that you believe that the majority of the people should elect its leader, or leaders of a country should be elected by the majority of the people. But of course, the system that we speak about is more than that. Right? When we talk about democracy, we really talk about liberal democracy, which combines popular sovereignty and majority rule with crucial elements and institutions like rule of law, like minority rights, and like separation of powers. Now, theoretically, populism is pro-democracy. It believes that the people should elect its leaders, but has issues with liberal democracy, particularly with minority rights. And I'm talking about political minorities rather than necessarily ethnic or religious minorities. There's problems with rule of law, independence of the court, independence of the media. In practice, what we see is that when populists are in power, they will attack some of the key institutions of liberal democracy, most notably the independence of the courts and the independence of the media. They also often try to make the executive much stronger than any other part. Whether they're successful depends mostly on how much power they have. Now, for this particular conference, I wanted to link the issue of populism to place, which is something that we don't devote too much attention to, because in much of the popular discussion, populism and nativism are conflated. And so the argument is that populists are against immigrants, that the other is the ethnic other. But that is the nativist distinction. For the populist, the other is the elite, and the elite is part of the same ethnic group. But essentially, populism is about center periphery, first and foremost in terms of power, but also to a large extent about values. And so in what is, I think, essentially populist terminology of David Goodhart's book, The Somewheres versus the Anywheres, right? There's this idea that there are the people who are from everywhere, and they don't really have authentic values. These are the cities, mostly the capital cities. And then there are the anywheres. These are the grounded people. Like they're from Middle England or from the American heartland. And that distinction, right, has a very clear geographical element to it, even though the distinction is actually not geographical. It is normative. There is this idea that there is a part of the country that has authentic values, where people are real and they're pure. And then there is a small part of the country which has all the power, where people are kind of either cosmopolite or corrupt, and they control the rest. And there is the connection between populism and place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaz. That's a great start, and I hope we can come back to you during the Q&A for additional insights. It's one of the tragedies of this format is that you experts get so little time. Next, I'd like to go to Professor Catherine Kramer, who is the Natalie C. Holton Chair of Letters and Science at the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is a scholar of public opinion and is the author of numerous publications, including the award-winning book, The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness in Wisconsin and the Rise of Scott Walker. Now, admittedly, she works on rural manifestations of populism, but the overlap with our focus today on industrial regions is clear. And I asked Kathy to tell us a little bit about what's happened in Wisconsin since the publication of her book in 2016, and where she thinks this process is leading in her state.
Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor to join you all. And Kaz, your introduction was so helpful. And so it will be my pleasure to share briefly with you what I learned in Wisconsin, and yes, what I think has happened since 2016. So thank you, Jeff. It's really an honor to be here, and thank you for the introduction. And what I'll do is share with you the nature of the rural resentment that I heard across the state of Wisconsin, which I wrote about in that Politics of Resentment book. And I'll start by saying I wasn't initially interested in a rural versus urban or center versus periphery divide. I grew up in Wisconsin, have spent most of my life in Wisconsin, but I naively did not recognize the extent of this division, the rural versus urban divide in Wisconsin or in the United States in general. But what I heard in smaller communities and rural areas throughout the state just surprised me and caught my attention. And as a political scientist, made me sit up and listen even more, because I recognized that what was going on in Wisconsin was relevant to the rest of the United States. And as I learned more, it was relevant to the rest of the world. So what I was doing was inviting myself into conversations of groups of people meeting in kind of neighborhood gathering places like gas stations and diners across the state of Wisconsin, not just in rural places. And I was going back to 27 different communities across the state repeatedly between 2007 and 2012. But it didn't take all that long for me to realize that what I was hearing in the smaller communities was important. And just briefly, some context for those of you who aren't familiar, in Wisconsin, we have two main metropolitan areas, Madison and Milwaukee, and roughly half of the population of the state lives in a non-metropolitan area. So it's part of the heartland. It's quite rural compared to many of the coastal states. So when I was spending time with people, I was asking very open-ended questions, just things like, tell me, what are the big concerns around here? And what I heard in the rural places and the smaller communities really surprised me. They were telling me in various ways that they were not getting their fair share. They just felt like they were getting the short end of the stick, that they were the victims of injustice, and they weren't getting their fair share of attention, of resources, or respect. And more briefly, what that sounded like was, with respect to attention, they were telling me, all the important decisions are made in the cities and communicated out to us, and there's little listening going on in reverse. And they just felt as though they had very little power. They also felt as though all of the wealth was in the cities and all of their taxpayer dollars were going to the cities. They perceived that their taxes were going up, and that the community, that the money was not coming back to their own communities. And finally, they were telling me in various ways, we are not getting our fair share of respect, because the people making the decisions that affect our lives, whether we're talking about government or industry or the healthcare industry, those folks don't know us. They don't understand what it's like to live in a smaller community or a rural place. And they don't even like us, right? They think we're uneducated, unsophisticated, racist, sexist, and so on. And so in various ways, as Kaz was saying, they were seeing themselves as kind of the real Americans, good, hardworking, real Americans whose lives were being disrespected, ignored, and in many ways harmed by these elite decision makers or these city people. And these notions of deservingness were very much bound up with the notions of hard work. So they would see people like me, professor at the flagship university in the state, as being relatively lazy to people like themselves who were often engaged in manual labor, whether it was farming or logging or mining in some respects, or construction, various jobs in which they were really using their bodies, wearing out their bodies, as they would say to me, so that by the time that they were near retirement age, they neither had the money nor the health to be able to really enjoy much of a leisurely retirement, for example. And I called this resentment because it seemed to me it had been simmering for many years. So at times it was anger, but it was sort of this sentiment of, we're victims, we are good, hardworking people, and we're not getting what we deserve. And it seems to us that there are people who are less deserving who are getting more than their fair share. And the resentment was powerful because there were many different layers to it. So they were resentful towards, and here's where I think that the populism as kind of an antipathy toward elite, but also nativism comes together. So the resentment that they were exhibiting was resentment towards cities and city people, which oftentimes meant urban professionals, urban elites, lefty elites, but also it meant at times people of color. And especially in a state like Wisconsin, which is highly racially segregated, usually the people who were in these small communities were white folks, and their resentment towards the cities was in part resentment toward people of color, whom they perceived were getting more than they deserved. And it was also resentment toward the Democratic Party, which, as you probably know, there's just increasingly a strong correlation between place and partisanship in the United States. And so they were perceiving that the Democratic Party was representing people in the cities, cared about people in the cities, and didn't care about people like them. So this was very fertile ground for politicians to tap into, like Scott Walker, who was a Republican who became governor of the state of Wisconsin, who really made public employees a target of blame. And it was talking about how those lazy desk workers who worked for the state government were getting more than their fair share, really enabled him to roll back government in many respects, including benefits for public employees. And one thing I want to point out is that I started my fieldwork in 2007. This was well before Scott Walker came to power as governor, well before Donald Trump, but certainly these sentiments were exacerbated by both of those politicians and tapped into, so made use of them, right? These sentiments of being on the short end of the stick were there and growing for many decades, but then politicians came along and said, you're right to be so upset, and you do deserve more than you're getting, and you are good, hardworking Americans, and vote for me and I will change that, right? So when Donald Trump came to power in 2016, I think since then in Wisconsin and elsewhere around the United States, these sentiments have just grown and deepened for a variety of reasons. One is that they're just more front and center in political commentary. There's just much more talk now about the rural versus urban divide, both the strong correlation with partisanship, but also these sentiments. And as Kaz mentioned, like the difference in values, there's this perception that people in rural America are different than people in urban America. They value different things. They spend their time different ways. They consume different things. They pay attention to different celebrities. They listen to different music. It's just as much a cultural divide as a partisan one. And we've also seen the economies diverge in terms of health, right? The recovery since the Great Recession has been much greater in our urban areas than in our rural areas. And the pandemic has really brought to light just the health of our health systems is very different in our rural versus urban areas. It's really in rather precarious state in many of our rural places. Now, not everybody in rural America, I want to point out, feels this way. Not everybody in the upper Midwest, which is what I've primarily studied, feels this way. And mainly what I have been describing is among white people. There's a significant portion of the population, rural population, primarily in the South, that are not white people, right? But it's an important political sentiment because of the way many of our swing states and presidential elections are these upper Midwestern states. And the rural areas are overrepresented, you might say, because of the way our seats are allocated to the US Senate, and also our first past the post single member district allocation of both our state legislatures and the US House means that these sentiments in rural areas are going to be politically important for some time to come. So thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Kathy. Excellent overview and update of a seminal book and study. I'd like to now turn to Stephen Weymouth, who happens to be a colleague of mine at Georgetown University. He's an associate professor in the McDonough School of Business. Stephen is an expert in international political economy with a focus on the winners and losers of international trade. He's the co-author of two very recent and what are sure to be highly influential articles, one just out in the American Political Science Review, the other coming out in International Organization that looks at populism in place. In fact, I should probably apologize for stealing his moniker for the title of this panel, but the IO article is expressly puts that concept into play. Stephen, I think we just would love to hear sort of the big takeaways from your recent round of research. They're very relevant to what we're doing here today.
Well, great. Thank you very much for having me, Jeff. And no need to apologize. We're all within the Georgetown community here, so you can take those those monikers at any point you want. So I want to do two things today. I want to try to answer two questions that have come up a lot in my discussions with other scholars about this particular topic. The first is, why now? Why now? We see this rise in right-wing populism, and it's not exactly now at this point. You know, we've kind of think back to the Brexit vote or the Trump's victory in 2016. But why, you know, within the last 5 to 6, 7 years are we seeing this upsurge, this surprising perhaps upsurge? And the second question that I want to tackle is why, that I get a lot actually, is why has it been of the right-wing variety? So other panelists have spoken a little bit to this, and I want to see if I can add anything to those two questions. So the first one, why now? I think, you know, to understand this question and try to get the heart of this issue, it's important to, I think, to turn to economic geography, which shows that there is significant variation within countries in the structure of employment and production. So there's systematic differences in economic performance and economic power that have emerged as a result of these of this distinction between employment in different regions of the country. So first of all, let me draw. Jeff mentioned the IO article that's coming out in the 75th anniversary special issue with my co-authors Lawrence Brose and Jeff Frieden, where we are explicitly looking at these issues of economic geography while focusing in particular on the decline of manufacturing employment. So US deindustrialization has led to a loss of approximately 9 million manufacturing jobs over the last 3 decades. And our first observation is that this has been a kind of a long-term phenomenon. These jobs started to disappear in the 1970s. You might say, all right, then if this has gone on for now a period of decades, why is it that we're seeing this backlash today? Well, I think, again, thinking about a few things here that are driving factors behind manufacturing job losses is going to be important to answering that question. And what we do is we focus on the role of technological change and the way that technological change has led to these differences in economic performance across the country. So I want to make 3 points related to technology. One is that ICT, information communication technology, principally the internet, has enabled, of course, kind of a global factory, the globalization of production, the disintegration of production, global value chains. And people refer to this in many different ways. But it simply means that there are now, of course, the ability for firms to exploit differences in labor costs around the world, and then set up their operations offshore. So that has contributed substantially to these losses of manufacturing jobs. All right, this is well known. This is the globalization hypothesis that's contributing to this economic distress that we've seen in the various regions of the country, but particularly in those where there used to be a lot of manufacturing employment, which happens to be in the industrial belt of the country and into the Southeast. Second point related to technology is that of automation. Automation is playing an increasing role, which means that things like robots can substitute for people, which further lowers the demand for labor in manufacturing work. There has not been a lot of studies yet to date examining the role of automation and the deployment of automating technologies around the country, and looking systematically at the impact of that type of displacement on our politics. But I think there's a lot of room for future research in that area. And the third point related to technology, one that I think is often overlooked, is that technology is increasingly enabling services to become tradable. So what we're doing today, we're engaging in a conference over Zoom. I and many others have taught over the last year over Zoom. And in some cases, we've taught to international audiences, to students in other countries. I'll teach a course this summer for students in Switzerland. That is the export of services. And this is not only a phenomenon, of course, that's affecting educational services, but all sorts of services now can be exported in ways that they weren't able to be exported before as a result of these new technologies. So we're seeing exporting in consulting services, in IT, in finance, in software. And that, of course, principally benefits a higher skill set worker. So those are the 3 points related to technology. Now, what is it that we see how does this manifest then in differences in performance around the country? I want to make 2 points related to economic geography. The first is that the manufacturing decline has decimated principally rural and suburban areas around the country. If you look at manufacturing employment, you'll notice that it tends to be a rural phenomenon, especially over the last 30 years. So there's also been as these jobs have been lost in rural areas, it's led to a decline in those communities as a result of various knock-on effects. So the decline of social services has led to problems related to increasing opioid abuse, alcoholism, and the so-called deaths of despair. These deaths of despair have disproportionately harmed communities that used to be manufacturing hubs. On the other hand, and this relates to the earlier point on services, we see services tend to agglomerate in what are now being called superstar cities, where there is knowledge sharing among services workers that leads to these incentives for agglomeration. But there also exists the types of amenities and the global outlook or cosmopolitanism that tends to attract workers within this particular sector. So there's also often a lot of workers with international backgrounds, for instance, working in these types of industries, and their values tend to align with a more cosmopolitan approach that we see in the cities. So technology, this is all to say that technology has led to differences in economic performance based on the structure of production between rural areas and urban areas. And these have further exacerbated kind of the cultural tensions that has been noted by a number of scholars in studying populism. Okay, so I think that helps explain a little bit of the question of why now. It's this consolidation of the regional disparities that has inflamed the urban-rural political divides over values that Kathy Kramer and others have talked about and written about extensively. The second question that I was hoping to answer is, why do we have populism now of a right-wing variety or a Trumpist variety in the United States, which tends to be more nationalist, which is focused on industrial revival, which is usually xenophobic, anti-immigrant, with a nostalgia implicitly or explicitly for a past racial hierarchy. To answer this question, and this is one that had come up so many times in previous discussions of the economic geography stuff, where people just say, look, there's got to be more to it than the economic geography. It doesn't make sense that we would have necessarily a right-wing version of this. Why not? Why isn't there a left populism that's emerged with such strong force in the United States? And so my paper that Jeff mentioned that's just come out in the American Political Science Review tries to answer this question. We look at 3 recent US presidential elections and examine specifically the 2016 election with great detail. And our answer to the question turns to social identity theory, which is just kind of being picked up now within political science. There's a long strand of this literature in sociology, but it essentially begins with the notion that society consists of various groups with different levels of power and status relative to one another. So our argument in this paper is that the decline of manufacturing and the subsequent impact on communities represents a status threat for some whites in these declining areas. Essentially, it's upending their expectations of their privileged status and leading them to a preference for reactionary candidates who promised a nationalist industrial revival, while at the same time signaling their understanding of these status concerns among white voters. So this is distinctly a right-wing version of populism for which there is great demand as a result of this decline in manufacturing and whites' response to it. Trump clearly tapped into this while offering manufacturing revival or promising to address the decline in manufacturing through trade policies and other means. He was less successful, of course, in doing so, but that was the promise of the campaign. And what do we find? Well, we find that if you look within the United States and at the county level, we're able to link the number of jobs lost in manufacturing to voting for Trump relative to votes that Romney received in the same counties in 2012. So where you get this delta, this increase in Trump, we take that as a proxy for greater support for this reactionary brand of politics. And what we find is that in these areas with greater manufacturing job losses, whites were more likely to vote for Republicans. And this holds in 2008, 12, and 16, but particularly in 16. We searched for mechanisms in the paper as well. And to do that, we looked at surveys. And we find that white voters in areas with more job losses were more likely to report obstacles to their individual upward mobility, which is in line with this theory that we have proposed related to status concerns. They're also more likely to report a broader American economic decline, which signals that they, seeing themselves often as prototypically American, are concerned about the future economic status of the country and its relative decline as they perceive it. So that tries to answer the question of why it's of the right-wing variety. In particular, left populists and tend to juxtapose the people versus a wealthy elite. There's less emphasis on racial hierarchy. There's less emphasis on immigration. The other tends to be the financial elite, the wealthy, rather than people who look different than you. So the status threat that some whites had that linked to this racial hierarchy and the declining status relative to their past, right, in these industrialized, in these industrial communities, it's very much a relative status, relative that is to the past, has led to this reactionary brand of politics. So those are my answers to those 2 questions, and I look forward to the discussion and to your questions. Hopefully we can further illuminate this response that we've seen of late in populism around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Fascinating research and a lot of interesting points of connection to both Kaz and Catherine's remarks. Hopefully we can pick those up in the Q&A. I'm going to turn, last not least, to Paulina Patana, who is, as we say in the business, a freshly minted PhD from Cornell University 2020. She's currently a democracy postdoctoral fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard University, and she will begin an appointment as an assistant professor in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown in 2022. Paulina did her research, or is doing research and focusing her publications on subnational variation in the rise and popularity of populist radical right-wing parties. She's had a specific focus on France and Finland, and her research methodologies share a lot in common with Kathy's participant observer approach, along with a quantitative approach distinguishes her work. Paulina, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff, and others for having me here today and for putting together this very timely and important symposium. So in my remarks, and very much building on what's been already said by others and the important work that my fellow panelists have done on this topic, I'm going to highlight a couple of what I think are key dimensions of why and how populist appeals resonate in some places, but not in others. And so my comments today will focus especially on the role of housing and residential mobility and how they affect the ways in which individuals perceive and react to local conditions and changes. And I'll offer insights from, as Jeff mentioned, my ongoing research on political geographies of populist radical right support in Finland and France, which I do believe that hold important lessons for the US and other European countries as well. So let me just very quickly set the scene by bringing your attention to two interrelated and very important dynamics that other panelists also were pointing to. So first of all, I also think that Jeff's concept paper lays out this really well already, is that this is how the gains of economic restructuring have been unequally distributed across different types of places. So while the transition to knowledge-based agglomeration economies may have been beneficial to national economies and economic growth more generally, it has also contributed to deep and widening inequalities within countries, some areas facing long-term economic decline, others becoming ever more prosperous. And so a key issue that countries are confronted with, and that Stephen was pointing to as well then, are these widening spatial divides in access to opportunities, overall prosperity and well-being in particular. So take Finland, for example, a country that's geographically almost as large as Germany, but where as much as 92% of current job creation is concentrated around the capital region of Helsinki-Uusimaa. So understandably, this creates a number of important challenges, opposing the more prosperous southern urban Finland that comprises only about 5% of the country's territory, with essentially the rest of the country that faces these challenges related to concentration. And then second, and importantly, is that these broader macroeconomic developments have also affected housing markets and residential mobility in many important ways. And as I will elaborate in just a bit, these dynamics also play a central role in understanding how individuals react and respond to these broader structural changes and growing spatial divides. So why are housing markets and residential constraints important in understanding how populism and place are connected? So let me elaborate on these dynamics. And so first of all, on the one hand, housing costs and affordability have become a growing concern in wealthier areas where economic opportunity and overall prosperity are concentrated, making these places increasingly out of reach for large numbers of individuals. And of course, this hasn't gone unnoted either. Recent reports do indeed show how housing affordability is a top concern for the majority of residents across metropolitan cities in the EU, how alarming numbers of individuals cannot afford to live in the place in which they work, or how the decline of affordable housing and gentrification of former working class neighborhoods are gradually pushing out growing numbers of lower income individuals in particular out of cities. And then on the other hand, places that are characterized by deindustrialization and structural decay are also confronted with the other side of the coin. And this relates to stagnating housing markets and declining property values. And this has also important consequences. So first of all, it can undermine the value of any household assets that are tied to real estate, making houses difficult to sell and thereby placing citizens at an increased risk of getting locked in these areas that are declining or struggling. So for example, one disgruntled radical rights supporter in rural Finland told me that it had already taken him over a year to try and sell his house because the area was lacking opportunities and services. And this was a particularly frustrating concern for him, given that he was already certain that he was going to lose money, regardless of whether he'd managed to sell his house or not. So viewed from this perspective, then, it's not surprising that all this has important consequences on individuals' lives, and in particular, their residential mobility, the rates of which have declined in many advanced democracies over the past decade or two, including in the US. Declining mobility hasn't, however, so far been closely considered in debates about, especially of how populism and place are connected, but they are an issue to pay close and careful attention to for a couple of reasons. So first of all, I think the dynamics that I just laid out about these housing market dynamics really call into question the widely held assumptions about perfect mobility that lies at the heart of theories of urban development and economics. And I think as Stephen mentioned as well, social mobility is also very closely connected to geographic mobility. So in France, for example, upward mobility for working to middle class is much higher in the capital region of Île-de-France compared to other areas in France. And constrained mobility can also put additional strain on the labor force, especially in the current context where flexibility, short-term contracts, and incentives to relocate to places where opportunities are located are already in many ways becoming the norm. So where does this all leave individuals who feel trapped in or relegated to places confronted with economic stagnation or decline? So in other words, what does it exactly mean to be or feel residentially constrained or stuck, and how might this be shaping how individuals are voting? So put in the simplest terms, I think it makes individuals have very limited means to react to local conditions and changes. So you could also think of this as them not being able to vote with their feet and therefore voicing their concerns or frustration by turning to populists, especially on the radical right parties. And so very quickly to illustrate this, let me offer some insights from my research in France by zooming in on individuals who live in areas that are confronted with these broader challenges related to spatial divides and where the French radical right has performed very strong in recent elections. So what my conversations with locals in these areas show is that residential constraints do indeed play a central role in how individuals perceive themselves, their localities, and their opportunities. So these residents, many of them who were radical right supporters, typically characterized themselves as quite far from being attached to any of these areas. Many describe these localities as bedroom communities or areas where most locals have to endure long daily commutes to access jobs and services, or stated how they lived there not by choice. What they stressed instead were the high cost of housing, lack of options, or the difficulties of relocating closer to more the desirable or prosperous areas. One person, I think, even very tellingly stated how those who can leave. And so this in turn has left many locals to deal with challenges related to, in their own words, of how cities are sucking up all the jobs, how access to public services are declining, and all this which one resident characterized as living in a prison where long commutes have become a costly and unwanted reality. And the dynamic is quite similar in Finland as well. So one radical right supporter in a rural community in Finland, for example, quickly connected the recent closing of a local factory, which was one of the major remaining local employers, to mobility concerns for its employees. So after the factory had closed, he told me that finding employment in the area became very difficult and moving elsewhere hardly an option, both because selling your home in an area with few and decreasing economic opportunities would be very difficult, and because a house elsewhere in areas where jobs would be available would be at least 4 times as expensive. So what this all reveals then is that is both that residential constraints are indeed a growing concern in many places and that they are an important source of resentment and discontent. And so as such, these concerns can become an important lens through which individuals in these places become receptive to populist appeals and these parties' reactionary rhetoric or exclusionary rhetoric about ordinary populations who are left behind, forgotten, or ignored. And what's important to note as well, and I think that the other panelists were getting at this as well, is that there's an important supply side dimension to the story as well. So in several contexts, populist parties in Finland and France, for example, are currently the only ones who are actively politicizing these issues and targeting voters in rural and peri-urban areas. And also with other major parties catering primarily to urban electorates, like in France. So this leads to political competition in areas outside cities, left dominated by the radical right, which then allows these parties to articulate these issues in nativist and nationalist terms and activate latent anti-immigration or hostility towards immigrant and these attitudes. Policy-wise, we know, however, that the solutions that they propose are typically hollow and lack substance. And so finally, by catering to urban electorates, other parties can also exacerbate these dynamics and the growing salience of residential mobility constraints and concerns in many ways. So there's one important recent study, for example, that shows how by increasingly catering to wealthier urban voters, the left in Britain has moved away from advocating affordable housing and thereby made cities more unaffordable to many of its previous working class supporters. So just to conclude, so when considering the connections between place populism and economic conditions, and especially how to address them, we should take seriously the ways in which individuals perceive them and their options to respond to local changes like those linked to deindustrialization and structural decay. And my research suggests that housing and residential mobility consideration play a very crucial part in this equation. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Paulina. And I'm glad you mentioned that distinction between demand and supply side of populism. Our focus, obviously, these 2 days is very much on the demand side. This distinction, incidentally, is something that Kazmuda and his colleague Cristobal Rovira Kaltwasser have written extensively about. But I'm sure at some point, repeatedly during the next 2 days, we'll be talking about the political entrepreneurs who look to make political hay out of these situations. It's now time for Q&A. We have about 20-25 minutes. And while you develop your questions, and you can feel free to put them in the chat or simply raise your hand, excuse me. I happen to notice that we have Tony Pippa of the Brookings Institution in the audience. And Tony has just written with a co-author an open memo to the Biden administration published back in January that calls for a national rural strategy to help rural communities develop and thrive. I wonder if Tony, if you'd be willing to just say a few words about this initiative and in particular its underlying political and economic logic.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and great discussion. So really, really pleased to be here. And I mean, I'm going to touch on themes that we've already heard some about from Kathy and from Stephen and Paulina. As Stephen and Paulina stressed, you know, the economic divergence within the United States has been quite stark, especially since 2008, with there being a fair amount, you know, some superstar cities that's really driving the bulk of our economic growth, and rural areas in particular having really been left behind. And it may seem counterintuitive when we think about federal policy, because many of the states that actually have the highest federal spending rates are for states that have large rural populations. But to Kathy's point, I think the people in those communities tend to perceive that as being social safety net programs. They don't see that as investment. They see that as just keeping heads above water. And the lack of political agency that they have over their futures whether that be with the economic decision-making happening elsewhere and public policy decision-making happening elsewhere, that they don't perceive to be in their best interests, really actually points to the lack of a coherent policy that we've had in the United States for a while around rural areas and around how the federal government should be thinking about investing and helping those communities transition and strengthen themselves and sort of their future. You know, we've got something like 400 plus programs. A lot of them are focused on things, whether it be a little piece of infrastructure here or a social service there. It's very hard for rural communities that are being buffeted by all the economic wins that we've talked about here today to sort of be able to navigate that. But at the same time, we don't really have a coherent vision of what will sustain those communities to make transitions with the new kind of global and national economies that we have. And so without investing in the software, so to speak, of people and local institutions and the local visions and strategies that they would like to help them transition and to be part of this new economy, especially when their own economies are really diversifying. It's no longer agriculture, even though at the policy level, we often continue to conflate rural with agriculture. And agriculture in the US only makes up about 6% or less of the rural jobs today. We just don't have a coherent policy right now that says, here's how we'll invest, and here's how investing will sort of build local ownership and the local vision of economic activity where they feel like they're in control of their own destinies. Now, the Biden-Harris administration, you know, both through the American Rescue Plan and through their proposals in the American Jobs Plan and the American Family Plan, has made it a priority for some of that investment to go to rural areas. There's a $5 billion proposal, for example, in the American Jobs Plan that's called the Rural Partnership Program, that's meant specifically to invest in sort of locally led strategies for redevelopment. But I think we're now reacting to a problem that we didn't prevent by having a coherent policy 15 to 20 years ago, as these sort of economic changes started to happen. And I think you're seeing it play out both economically, but also politically and culturally, as Kathy was talking about.
Great, thank you, Tony. I have two questions. I'm going to go to Stephen Grand first, and then I'll read a question from Ben Ponce, and these will be to the panelists. Stephen.
Yes, thanks, Jeff. Really interesting conversation so far. I just wanted to try to parse a couple of different strands that seem like they could be complementary, but in some parts they may also be contradictory. One is this notion of regions left behind, which seems to be about economic decline or economic dislocation. And the clear solution then is industrial policy, it seems. And a second that Kathy brought up is more sort of cultural attachment to place, which is more about an affinity to an area. And then Paulina talked about the difficulty of residential mobility for many of those left behind, which suggests not an attachment to place, but an inability to get to a place, which is a bit different. And I wanted to just throw a fourth strand on that we haven't really talked about, which is education, and how much education rather than industrial policy might be an antidote to populism. Thanks.
Thank you. And Ben Ponce's question, which is a policy relevant question. It might actually be worth asking this question later in the symposium again. Is there any evidence to suggest that initiatives such as regional devolution or federalism in the U.S. do anything to cultivate a sense of agency on their own, that is, an independent of economic development that could stem these populist tides? Any thoughts from our panelists, either in response to these questions or strands that were picked up by colleagues during their remarks? I would love to give our panelists a chance to kind of come back in on this. Kathy?
I can speak briefly to both, I think. One, with respect to education, that's a great topic to bring up. I don't necessarily have an answer, but one reflection is that perceptions of what education is needed are very much intertwined with kind of cultural perceptions in terms of there's increasingly a correlation. I'm not sure if it's accurate to call it a correlation, but a relationship between perceptions of urban areas as elitist and left-leaning and higher education, and increasingly we see people arguing that say a liberal arts degree is something for the economic as well as the cultural elite, and that really what we need is just more job training, and that say technical colleges are the answer as opposed to something more akin to a liberal arts degree. There's obviously a lot of legitimacy to that, but the conversation about education has become very has this cultural underpinning, which is not necessarily about what kind of education people actually need, which I think is something to pay attention to. It's become quite partisan, I think. And then with respect to federalism, one reflection I have there is that federalism in a way kind of hinders the agency of areas, because as we devolve policy to the local area, areas that are impoverished and hard hit economically then have to kind of fend for themselves in a way, without more assistance from kind of an overarching government that can redistribute. So those are my two reflections.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists want to chime in? Stephen, did you have something?
I will, but I noticed that Cass has his hand up. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go to Cass first, and then I'll come back to Stephen. I'm so focused on the pictures, I'm not looking at the icons. Cass.
I'm sorry. This is like what the kids do, so I thought I would throw the icon in. So I just want to make a few comments about things that brought up. I think, so in the discussion about populism, but particularly about the populist radical right, there is this distinction between economic anxiety and cultural backlash, as if these two are completely separated. And I think that's too simplistic. What we do know is that for 30 years or something, like research shows that cultural backlash, cultural issues, particularly racial issues, are driving votes for the radical right. However, right, there clearly is an economic dimension too. I think that we have to be careful though to seeing this purely as an economically driven phenomenon, particularly not the dissent or the dissatisfaction, right, but particularly the political translation of it into the populist radical right, which sadly is the reason why we're often so concerned. I mean, which shows that their voice and their vote was actually used well, because these areas have been ignored for decades, and they only now get attention because they have turned towards the radical right. But what the radical right does is they give a social-cultural translation of socioeconomic frustrations, right? Because if it was purely this argument about socioeconomic status decline, like, then why not go to the left wing, to the radical left, which has a much more fundamental analysis about this. But this social status anxiety thesis, which goes back to Seymour Martin Lipset in 1955, right, is kind of a conflation of economic anxieties, but also very much cultural anxieties relate to race, but also to gender and others. Now, with regard to education, we do know that with regard to the right-wing populists, that generally it's not necessarily that they only get lower educated voters, but they get disproportionately little highly educated voters. That is not necessarily the case with left-wing populists. I think we should be careful, though, that you can invest whatever you want in education, including vocational training, which I think has been marginalized for decades now. But if this doesn't lead into decent jobs, well-paying jobs, the only thing you do is you raise expectations of people that are then not met. And this is, of course, one of the key problems. It's not just that people cannot find jobs, but a lot of people who find jobs find very unsatisfactory jobs. And that is a much bigger problem, which has little to do with regional divides, because this also applies to people in the cities.
No, that's an excellent point. If I could just ask a follow-up to you, Kaz. I mean, you've written obviously extensively about populism and its anti-elitist standpoint. It's sort of almost the foundation rock for all the manifestations of populism that we see around the world. Does that in some ways render it very difficult to come at the problem with policy solutions? I mean, if people are mistrustful of elites and as mistrustful of experts, they're also likely to be very mistrustful of any policy initiative that's designed to improve their lives. Are we kind of behind the eight ball to begin with this initiative, or would you have a little more hope than that?
A little bit more hope. I mean, first of all, populists love academics that love their case. And so we have a lot of populism whisperers these days in academia who are all the time trotted out by populist leaders as like real academics who understand the people. So because academics have become so involved in political debates, we have become part of the political struggle. But also, it is in part about what we talk about. Like the reason why we have this divide, this populist divide or this nativist divide, is because that is what we talk about. I think if you have politicians who focus on some of the key issues, like housing, like education, like healthcare, etc., and just by and large get things done and help shift the conversation away from the culture wars type of domination, that a lot of these people will not necessarily become more pro-elite, but they will have less resentment. Their resentment won't drive their political actions. In that sense, I think Biden is actually doing the perfect thing by not engaging in the culture wars and pretty much just dealing with issues, some of which driven by his own part of the agenda, and some of them driven by undermining like the support base of the Republican Party.
Very interesting. Stephen, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of echo what some other people have said. I'm not an expert, first of all, though, in kind of place-based policies or their relative effectiveness. But in general, based on kind of the analysis that the things that we've learned over the last several years, I'm fairly pessimistic about the amelioration of these populist tendencies in Western democracies, largely because the factors driving them really haven't gone away. And there's no indication that they're going to go away. So a lot of my work has been linking this to the deindustrialization trends, and that's not only a U.S. phenomenon; it's all throughout Western Europe. To this support for populism through the economic anxiety channel as well as the cultural backlash channels, and those jobs just simply aren't coming back. So the promise that they, when politicians promise them that they will come back and then they don't, I think it just further fuels the resentments that have driven them towards these lines of political thought in the past. So I'm relatively pessimistic. So thinking about ways to deal with this, I think they're more of a long-term type approach. that because these jobs aren't coming back, there needs to be a transition towards other forms of employment, generally in the service sector. But as other people have stated, the average manufacturing worker, the job that they get in services is going to result in a significant wage decline. There's a wage premium in manufacturing that's been well recognized. So for the person with you hold education constant, the manufacturing job pays about $10,000 a year more than the comparable service sector job for these people, for the people with that type of that level of education. So retraining is an option, I guess, but I think that it's something that's incredibly expensive, and we don't have a lot of evidence that it works that well. So I'm thinking more multi-generational approaches and education leading to better jobs for future generations, I think is hopeful. But in the meantime, I don't think it's going to be enough to address this current wave. And I agree with Cass that the emphasis on culture and the fact that there is resentment linked to race means that the more we focus on race and differences, probably the more difficult it is to bring people away from the populist temptation, I guess we'll call it. So I worry about our current politics. I worry that the current economic trends are not in our favor. And deindustrialization is one economic shock, but there are other economic shocks. We're currently undergoing the COVID shock, where the COVID economy is without question exacerbating inequalities. All the gains have gone to the top in the last year, whereas the middle class has suffered immensely, particularly women and people of color. It bears out in the data. So this is driving new forms of inequality and accelerating other forms of inequality that we've seen over the last decade, and it's going to be a challenge to address these in a way that doesn't lead to significant continued political backlash.
Yes, and so as we're kind of left with Andres Rodriguez Poza's sardonic title of one of his articles, "The Revenge of the Places That Don't Matter," is going to be with us for a while. I don't want to exclude Paulina from the conversation. Paulina, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, just very briefly. I think that my comments follow very much on what others said already. So I think that one thing that's very important to keep in mind, and I think that Cos has written and talked a lot about this, is how I think there's a clear danger. What we see happening in the Nordic countries, in France, for example, what Macron is sort of doing right now is by trying to sort of flirt with the ideas of or cater and co-opt the sort of the politics and the rhetoric that the radical right is really putting forward is a very dangerous route, and that does not lead to any good outcomes. Rather, it just plays into the hands of these parties in ways that just reinforce their power and their sort of the position in terms of issue ownership over these factors. So I think that addressing the key concerns in these declining areas is something really to focus on. And just in terms of the sort of role of education, I think that in the Nordic countries and in Finland in particular, something that also is important to keep in mind is that the sort of decline of these rural or deindustrialized regions or areas is also very much driven by the fact that access to education in these countries is universal, and it's relatively easy for younger generations to access education. But this also just leads to important divides in sort of the people who actually do get educated and do gain, who would like to come back. They have few means of doing so because of all the higher educated, higher skilled positions are located very much in the metropolitan areas. So even there, for individuals who would like to come back, contribute their tax revenues, and sort of sustain local communities in which they grew up. That's very much not a possibility for many individuals, and something also to keep in mind when considering the dynamics.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I think we're at our break point, and in the interest of keeping on schedule, I'll close this very interesting discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists for their very insightful remarks. And I also want to thank them for going a little bit beyond the call of duty. You know, each of you is working at sort of at the nexus of theory and analysis. It's not always easy to extrapolate from what you're doing to the policy implications. And so I appreciate very much your willingness to kind of take that risk and give us some insights into how your ideas might actually work out in the practical world. Well done, and I'm going to turn this back over to Brian Hansen.
Great. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to the panel. Great discussion. Remarkably, we are on time, which is an achievement in the conference world. So I'm going to get us to our break. We did promise one. We've got a 10-minute break. I just want to note that right when we get back from break at 5 minutes before the hour, we're having a talk from Mikhail Vasiliadis, who is the president of the Industrial Union of Mining, Chemical, and Energy of Germany, and there will be a Q&A session afterwards. So encourage you to come promptly back from the break and look forward to continuing our discussion. Thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome back from break. I hope you got a chance to get up and stretch your legs a little bit there. We're moving on. Also, just want to say thank you all for engaging in the process of holding in the waiting room until you're admitted. We want to make sure that this conversation is folks who have been in of our program today connects very nicely to the conversation we've been having all morning, where one of the recurring themes had been about the importance of jobs and good jobs. And we have with us, very pleased and honored to have with us, Mikhail Vasiliadis, who is the president of the Industrial Union of Mining, Chemical, and Energy. He's held that position since 2009. He's also president of the Industrial European Trade Union, and he's held that position since May of 2012. I will preserve the time for the discussion as opposed to going through all the posts that he's held. But let me just say that he has held various functions in the industrial unions on the local, state, and federal level. Mikhail, welcome so much to this forum and look forward to your comments.
Yes, thank you for the invitation for this interesting conference. And I would like to share some experience about the concrete economical, social, and regional effects of the climate policy transformation in Germany, because this also have an impact on jobs and perspective of the regions. A key topic in the last few years was the transformation to a climate-friendly energy generation in Germany, as you know, but combined with a decision to phase out also nuclear power by 2022. I'm talking about a process that aims to replace almost 62% of the fossil and nuclear energy generation in Germany to a more or less climate neutral way by 2038. So this is a real challenge, as you see. In the context of these energy turnarounds, we call it Energiewende in Germany, the federal government has decided to end lignite mining in the Rhinish mining area, which is in West Germany, and the Lausitz area, which is in East Germany. The government strives to contribute to the decarbonization of Germany's economy and society. I have a participation in this federal government commission, which was called Growth, Structural Change and Employment. It was not called Coal Phase Out. It has created a broad consensus at the end in society on how to shape the structural changes in Germany based energy and climate policy. The creation of concrete perspective for new future-proof jobs in the affected region was at the forefront. Structural changes, you know, in Eastern Germany has been seen since 1990 when the merger of the former East and West Germany has been ended. So at the end, our East German colleagues have seen a lot of hard times when it comes to unemployment, closure of companies, and so on. And they are affected once again by this climate energy transformation. They have made the most of their opportunities with the help of transfers and the federal government's growth core programs for the East German part in the last 30 years. This is the painful decline of once dominant sectors and proud workers version in this region. The longest transition experience we had is in the so-called Ruhrgebiet. This is more or less the concentration region where heavy industry and hard coal was located in the past. After 60 years, coal mining, hard coal mining ended at the end of 2019, and the last mine was closed. As a result, it was hard, but at the end, a successful transformation process. Many new business and jobs have been created by using research and learning institution, by using innovation and ecological transformation through cooperation between the local government and also the trade union and the workers within the industry. I would like to focus with you some analytical consideration about this experience that are relevant for sustainable industrial policy. They concern a new corporatism and a good practice we have already done. So a new quality of corporatism in Germany can be seen in the work of the Structural Change Commission. Not only did the Commission work quickly between June 2018 and January 2019, but it also explained the group of stakeholders, including NGOs from the ecological interesting groups. It has developed new forms of effective cooperation. Broad parameters have been set for the path to the end of the coal production and power generation. Emission targets, expansion of renewable energies or pipeline social measuring points such as structural development and jobs. The value of the debate culture in the Commission, the major issue for future was discussed in a fact-based manner in a class of ideas and in the end in meaningful cooperation. New form of governance was introduced, not only shutting down a technology and social cushioning, but active innovation governance with targeting innovations and investments. And the spirit of invention, both the final report and the activity and funding commitments of the federal and state governments and the companies were important, but only the beginning. The political consensus reached and the funding pledges must be turned into concrete action now. What is the perspective for these two regions? From the experience of structural change in Eastern Germany, we know that region develop well when a number of factors are present locally. Motivated entrepreneurs, practically oriented science, qualified employees, committed regional politicians, and open-minded administration. In other words, people who know what to do with the funding. However, these success factors are not present everywhere. Regions need a lot of capital and scientific know-how if they want to bring technical-based innovation products at the end to the market. However, this innovation perspective does not fit all regions in Europe. The deindustrialized regions in Andalusia, in Spain, or in some other areas are really lacking. Capital, science, and qualified people are scarce there. Here, networking with national and European value chain is not a realistic option for the regional policy. There must therefore be at least a second innovation perspective for this region. In addition to the technology and capital-based option of innovation, the idea of organizational innovation with cooperatively low resources also deserves to be considered. This variant also exists in Eastern Germany. The Federal Ministry of Research and Technology reports on the supply of regional food and certain market segments in Berlin. School buses that are empty most of the day are used for this. This example has a paradigmatic character. It's about a different organization of regional market. The actors in this region have to reflect on their assets, people who are cooperate and translate good ideas into good practice. At the end, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, with the points of political cooperation and regional structural policy I have already described, it's not necessarily guaranteed that the formation will be also succeed. Many unanswered questions, such exactly investment in new energy generation, as well as in industrial value creation and work in general, are still ahead of us. But when decision makers are looking for ways to turn the transformation into an economic, ecological, and social success story, I am convinced that nothing can ignore a dialogue between politics, economics, companies, and civil society. Everything else leaves damages. Thank you very much for your attention.
Terrific. Thank you very much for your comments. We have an opportunity for some dialogue and questions. So please feel free to raise your hand or send a message to me in the chat. I've got a first question already, which is from Wolfgang Mossinger.
Yes, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Michael Vassiliadis, for being in this event. How much does the German law on co-determination has helped to create this kind of networking, this kind of stakeholder society in the transformation process in the Ruhr Valley, which is of course a long-standing tradition since the 1950s with the co-determination? And probably you could just say a couple of words on what that is and why this has helped you to have an impact in this process.
Well, this is a very, very important point on both sides. In the Ruhrgebiet area, when it comes to hard coal phase out, and now when it comes to the lignite coal on, because there in the mining sector, we have the strongest version of co-determination, which more or less means that we are together face by face with the management to discuss and to have the right to discuss future and strategic issues. So in generally, we have had some conflict within the company, but we have cleared it because we have seen the challenges of phasing out. And it was very, very clear that we have two sides. The one side is to make this phase out possible for the company and have the successful future path. And on the other hand, it was very, very clear that this phase out could not be a disaster for all the working people. So this was a common, it was a hard discussion, but at the end, it was a common position of management and workers. So when we went out and discussed all these issues with government, we was more or less joined. So this was very important because if you have conflicts in every side, somebody lose. And what is behind this co-determination idea is to find a way, this works not always, but in most of the cases, not to produce losers of transformations, also in the past. The ideal point is a triple win. For example, for the nature, for ecological issues, for companies, for innovation investments, and of course, for investing in people. So I call it investing in people for their future, make them future-able. So the idea is that these rights and this culture have a goal. It's not only a right, it's have a goal to make things at the end balanced. Because everything which is unbalanced came back later as costs or as disasters. So this is the idea behind, and this was very, very important. If you combine it to some other areas where we don't have so hard rights, for example, a US company, we try, my friend from Verdi, which is another trade union, try to come in this very successful Amazon thing. So they have really problems to come in as a trade union and to build up this culture. And of course, we are waiting. Also, there's a big investment of Tesla in eastern part of Germany. But as I see, they have to learn something about this German culture.
Very good. Next up, somebody who does know about German culture and labor, Steve Sylvia.
Hello, Michael. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm fine.
Yes. So I have a question. Something that you're certainly aware of, but I think our American audience would be less likely to be aware of. I was just curious how this recent German Supreme Court decision, which is going to require a redrafting of the government's climate policy, is going to affect the carefully crafted compromise that you developed.
Yes, of course. We were all a bit surprised. I have a Zoom meeting with some managers and some trade union with the German chancellor and government this morning. And also the government was surprised how deep this decision goes into this rights of the nature, I call it so. So what was decided? The one thing is very logical, so I support it. The Supreme Court asked for that German government have made big goals running down the road to 2050, but have not really milestones. So the court asked, so how would you do it? How would you like to do it? You only have a plan for 2030. And then they create a second thing, and this is very important. Said, okay, if you do it like this, then you transfer a lot of these issues in a period where the next generation have to solve it. So they call it put pressure on the next generation and their freedom rights. So this was the case. And so this was a bit surprising because it's very, very new way to argue. So I asked the government and said, okay, I'm fine with that because it's true. But what's about the next generation if they have no jobs and their freedom rights and their chances for creating their own families and futures? So we, once again, at the end of the day, it's all about balancing out different things. And in the moment, we have a very, very green stream in our society. We are a rich society, and most of the people have enough money for being green. So I try to avoid a discussion between the workers and these necessary decisions to fight against it. So I try to create a goal and an opportunity also for our industrial workers and all the workers for having a good future within this transformation. This is not easy, but it's possible.
Terrific. And next up is Knut Panknen, please.
Yeah, hello. Hi, Michael. It's good to see you. And hi, Brian. Thanks for allowing me to ask a question. Michael, I just wanted to know whether you are aware that the US mine workers made headlines recently with their announcement that they said, you know, the transition and the change is coming, whether we like it or not. And these are our demands for our workers towards a just transition, similar to what you've described for Germany. So my question was just, are you aware of this, and are you in contact with your US colleagues to help make this an international effort for a just transition?
I have heard that already, and I know that it needs a lot of power to do this step, because for this trade union, as for us, it's also a transformation for the trade union itself. But I think it's absolutely the right way. I've heard it. I have not the chance to get in touch, but I fully support. And if my friends like to have some support from us, we do, because it's very, very important. that especially this region in the US, which was already infected and will be infected, will have a future perspective and not only that what we have seen for years now.
Terrific. And my colleague and co-organizer, Jeff Anderson, wants to join the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering, Mr. Vassiliadis, you know, the unions in the United States are obviously much weaker than their counterparts in the Federal Republic. So based on your experience with promoting structural adaptation in Germany, a process in which the representatives of the workers are umbilically involved, what advice would you give U.S. workers and their representatives who are looking to shape the transformation process in their own sectors and regions?
Yeah, first, Jeff, you have a nice bass guitar behind you because I'm a musician.
You are good.
So I have to mention it. So second, well, maybe compared to the German situation and our rights we have, it seems that the trade union in the US are weaker. I think there are structural issues behind it because we are nationwide and so on. At the end, I think there is a chance and it's a possibility to develop also influence and positions like we have done it. When you ask me really what is necessary for it, first, you have to have competences. I think they can organize it. You have to know what you're talking about. I think that I'm sure that is the case. The second is you need leadership and you have to ensure that your member is following you. This is much easier for me because I have 600,000 members, but nationwide, but I'm one trade union. So, but the third is really important. I've been several times in Washington and was asked about the secret behind Kurzarbeit and the secret behind our way to solve crisis and so on. At the end, it is the political goal to go the cooperative way. If you have the goal or if you have the culture to fight, everybody will fight. So at the end, because the trade union compared to the management rights in the US are weaker, the first step has to be made by management and politics, because they have to ensure their trust that if they involved in such a process, that they don't lose everything. So at the end, we have an experience over decades. So I can do that. But if I compare it to the US, I think you have to build an environment, maybe starting in small projects, but scale it up. And I think you need also some help with good examples from other regions. So if there is a demand for hearing more of these stories, not everything is successful what we have done, of course not. But a lot of things, if you go the main road, are very successful. And I hope that it also will go successfully to the future, because what we are facing now, because we have set up these goals of climate transformation faster and faster, and there are not all the answers there on the table. So we are looking into the complicated phase of all these situation. But once again, I think there is everything in the US now for scale it up, but somebody have to manage it.
Well, that is a very optimistic note on which to end. And since we're trying to find solutions, I appreciate the optimistic point there. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience and this, incredibly important transformation and how you all are approaching it. Really appreciate it very much. And moving to our next element of our program, we have a panel which touches on other subjects that we've talked about today, namely the importance and the innovations that's going on that is happening inside of cities. We've got a mayors panel of mayors that represent not only different cities, but from different countries as well. And to lead that discussion is my colleague, Lizzie Shackelford. And Lizzie joined the council in January of this year in order to, as a senior fellow on US foreign policy, in order really to work at the intersection of fostering dialogue about global affairs and this region, the Midwest region, and the linkages between what's happening globally and the opportunities and challenges it creates regionally. So with that, let me turn it over to Lizzie to introduce our mayors panel.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm really, really excited to be here today to moderate this discussion, our Mayor's Roundtable discussion. I'd like to briefly introduce our three distinguished guests. Then I will be asking each of them some questions to highlight their experiences and the changes that they have both seen and led in their cities. After that, in about a half hour, we'll be opening up to questions and discussions from the audience. So please feel free to post questions in the chat or to use the raise hand function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. I think everyone here is Zoom pros by now. But if you use the raise hand function, I'll call on you to ask the question directly at that point. So I'll turn to introducing our distinguished guests, starting with Tom Barrett, who was elected Milwaukee's 40th mayor in 2004 and is now serving his 5th term. He previously served 5 terms as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Wisconsin's 5th congressional district. Mayor Barrett earned a BA in economics and his JD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Mayor Barrett's work has been instrumental in the city's success in reimagining former industrial sites, navigating the local impact of national housing issues, and promoting growth in the center of Milwaukee. He has championed the creation of family-supporting jobs, provided assistance to entrepreneurs, and worked to increase safety in Milwaukee's neighborhoods. He is a founding member of Mayors Against Illegal Guns and also established the Environmental Collaboration Office, which advances cost-effective sustainability practices that meet Milwaukee's environmental, economic, and social needs while enhancing economic growth. We also have with us today Drew Dilkens, Mayor of the City of Windsor, Ontario. He's held that position since 2014 and is a lifelong resident of the city. Mayor Dilkens holds business and law degrees from the University of Windsor and an MBA from Wayne State University. He received his doctorate of business administration from the International School of Management in Paris, France, with a focus on municipal amalgamation in Ontario. Mayor Dilkens was re-elected to a 2nd term in 2018. Since being elected, he has continued to focus on improving the city's infrastructure, including roads and sewers, holding the line on taxes, supporting economic development that creates jobs and attracts investments, and positioning Windsor as a destination of choice for those looking to build homes, careers, and families. And finally, we have Andy Burnham, who was elected as mayor of Greater Manchester in May of 2017. Responsible for shaping the future of Greater Manchester, Mayor Burnham's priorities include ending rough sleeping, transforming Greater Manchester into one of the greenest city regions in Europe, and making Greater Manchester a great place to live, get on, and grow old. Before being elected as mayor, he was an MP for Lee from 2001. In government, he has also held ministerial positions at the Home Office, Department of Health, and Treasury, and in 2008 became Secretary of State for Culture, Media, and Sport before returning to health as Secretary of State in 2009. So I want to say thank you to each of the mayors for joining us. As you already understand, and those I will tell you were abbreviated biographies, we have a lot of great experience, not only as mayors, but in different aspects of government and city and national life. So I'm very pleased to be able to moderate this discussion today. We will start by turning to Mayor Barrett. You have led Milwaukee for quite some time now, and I gather that Milwaukee was once the machine tool capital of the US, also known for beer, and famously home to the Harley-Davidson motorcycles. But 20 plus years ago, you and the civic and business leaders worked to rebrand and reposition Milwaukee's economy, particularly around water. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did and how that has worked?
I would love to, Lucy, and thank you very much. It's always great to be with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And I want to start out by bearing my soul a little bit, if you'll allow me to do that. because one of the things that has always bothered me, and I think I've actually said this to the Chicago Council once before, is when people talk about the challenges that are faced in the Rust Belt. And that gets right to your point about the machine shop of the world, which we were and we're proud to be, but things change. And my view is whoever dreamed up the term Rust Belt, you think of the Rust Belt and you think of the Sun Belt. And when you think of sun, you think of a glorious day and everyone being happy. You don't think the same thing when you think about rust. And it really doesn't capture who we are, because who we are, and I'm glad that the mayor is here from Windsor, we are on America and Canada's fresh coast. We are blessed to be on the shores of the greatest freshwater supply on this planet. And that really has been the key to our economy, a key to our history, to our recreation, to our education, and I think to our future. And so did we go through some challenging times? Absolutely, absolutely. But the old trope of lumping Midwestern industrial cities together under the dismissive moniker of Rust Belt is as dated as it is inaccurate. Because the fact of the matter is, despite losing nearly half of our manufacturing employment base since 1970, Milwaukee has consistently ranked among the top 20 metros in per capita income for the last 50 years. So we've made this seismic change really by being nimble and by attracting companies and retaining companies that still have an industrial flavor to them, but the world has changed. And so I think one of the keys is to be as nimble as you can to try to build on what's coming in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mayor Barrett. We're really grateful to have you. We'll turn now to Mayor Dilkens. Can you tell us a little bit about Windsor, Ontario? What people do there, how it has evolved, and as well, I gather that you've recently announced a new strategic economic development called Windsor Works, with help from some economic development advisors from the UK. Can you tell us what moved you to act in that plan and where you're trying to take Windsor now?
Yeah, happy to do so. And good morning, everyone. Really delighted to join everyone today. And thanks for the invitation to be here. You know, Milwaukee is a place everyone knows because of Laverne and Shirley, if nothing else. But because there are TV shows made about it, and it's a great place. And Milwaukee just is a fantastic city, well known across the world, I would submit. But the city of Windsor is about half the size of Milwaukee, and people often refer to us as the city on the other side of the US-Canada border from Detroit. And we are an international gateway. We're home to the busiest border crossing between Canada and the United States, and we're located directly across the Detroit River from Detroit, Michigan. And we are, with Detroit, Windsor and Detroit are the two largest urban areas this close to one another along the entire US-Canada border. Windsor is the automotive capital of Canada, like Detroit is the automotive capital of the US. And the supply chains here are highly integrated on both sides of the border. In fact, the average part that goes into a vehicle crosses the border about 6 times before it rolls off the final assembly line. Now, being Canada's southernmost city, of course, we're known for an incredible climate, all sorts of trails and world-class gaming and entertainment. We were home to many stops along the Underground Railroad, so there's a great Underground Railroad history here as well. And as well as lots of places that tell the stories of our rich automotive history, but also our links to prohibition. Historically, Windsor has also been an auto, industrial, and manufacturing community, and our city has really made a name for itself by transforming metal into something meaningful. And many people will also know that we produce a lot of gold here, and that is liquid gold, because we are home to Hiram Walker & Sons, North America's largest distillery and producers of Canadian Club and J.P. Weiser whiskey. People also know us for Windsor Salt. Maybe you don't know us for Windsor Salt, but you know Windsor Salt, and it's put more salt on kitchen tables and winter roads than probably most of us would care to think of. But all of these products we're known for around the world and have been shipping around the world for more than a century. And I think that, you know, people choose Windsor for the opportunities and the lifestyle, and we have all of the best parts of a small Canadian city, with all of the major amenities just a few miles away in the city of Detroit. But over the last decade, we've watched Windsor's economy outperform most other locations, but it certainly has not been without its challenges. And we're excited about big projects like the new Gordie Howe International Bridge connecting Windsor and Detroit, one of the largest infrastructure projects in Canada. And we're also in the midst of construction or in the planning process of a new regional mega hospital that will really transform our healthcare system at this particular part of Canada. And there are significant headwinds. There's no doubt that we are too reliant on traditional manufacturing and we have to diversify. And automation, border policies, they certainly present risks to our narrow economic foundation, and that must be expanded. And Lizzie, you talked about and you asked about Windsor Works, and that's the economic development strategy that our city council unanimously adopted not too long ago. And it was born from a situation that occurred in 2018, and I think the other mayors on the line can appreciate this. When I was elected to my second term in 2018, Ontario was rocked, along with Michigan and Ohio, by news from General Motors that they were closing several plants, including one up the road closer to Toronto in Oshawa, Ontario. And they weren't closing to send the work to Mexico or China or because the quality was insufficient. They were closing operations to save billions and focus on autonomous and electric vehicles. And right away, as I was writing my inaugural address, I thought about the 6,000 families that would be affected by those closures, and I wondered what would happen if our largest employer, Stellantis, makers of the Chrysler minivan, were to close here. And I threw the speech I was writing in the garbage, and I said, I have to focus on this because we are too much at risk, and we need some shock absorbers, and we need a roadmap. And that's what Windsor Works was all about, was preparing a roadmap to help us leverage our strengths and capitalize on the new opportunities. And we prepared this roadmap, and we specifically went out to someone who had never been here. I wanted people who did not have a flavor for the community, who wanted to look at this, look at research objectively, look at the situation with clean eyes and clean hands, fresh eyes. And we went out to a UK firm called Public First, and we prepared this plan to help us build back better after the pandemic. After the vaccines get pumped into arms, we realized that we have to build back better, and that's what Windsor Works is all about. And we know that there is nothing from our perspective that's going to turn us into Canada's next Kitchener-Waterloo tech cluster or Pittsburgh's health sciences hub, but we know we have a lot going for us. We have strong fundamentals to build on, and we need to do a better job of leveraging our strengths. And that's where the Windsor Works plan comes in, and our LIFT strategy, which stands for location, infrastructure, future economy, and talent. And so it's really leveraging all of the strengths that we have and not trying to push the eject button on everything. We still want to have a very strong presence in automotive, but how do we pivot to be a centerpiece or an area of excellence with respect to the new automotive economy and the future of automotive? And we know that electric vehicles are going to be part of the future and advanced designs, and we need to build in our educational institutions here, the University of Windsor and St. Clair College, in a more strategic way to make sure that we can keep the folks, the kids that are graduating, from thinking that it's better to go to Toronto to find a job than it is to stay here. And so we're excited about this plan. We're working on putting the pieces together, and there's no doubt this plan will not be executed with a political term as its horizon. This will take a number of incremental steps over a longer period of time. I guess like everything in life, time and money, we'll be able to get to the end goal of executing this, to put the shock absorbers in place. And I'm really, really excited about the future of what I see happening here in this region, in our country, and across our continent. And Windsor Works is going to help us take our little piece of the pie and be successful.
Thank you so much, Mayor Dilkens. I already know more about Windsor than I knew earlier, and I'm very interested about the Underground Railroad history there. But anyway, we will return to some additional questions with you shortly, but we want to turn now to Mayor Burnham, moving a little bit further afield now. Mayor Burnham, how did Greater Manchester evolve from Cottonopolis to today being one of the thriving northern cities, while others in the Midlands and the North still languish? And where are you trying to take the city now?
Well, thanks very much, Lizzie. Good morning, everybody. Afternoon here in the UK. I'm struggling to know how to compete in this company, the home of beer, the home of Laverne and Shirley. What can I offer? A football club that you might have heard of, or two. But yeah, we're in great company because we've got a lot in common with our colleagues from Milwaukee and Windsor. And if I'm looking a little tired but a little relieved, is because I came through another mayoral election at the weekend and re-elected on Saturday. Thank you. I appreciate the support. And I want to say a little about the vision. I think that's obviously played a little bit of a part in that. But to answer your question, Lizzie, you reference Manchester as Cottonopolis. For those who don't know, just to tell people what that means, we were the kind of the home of the Industrial Revolution, because textiles in the UK led, it was the industry that led the mechanization of industry, the home of the spinning jenny, which was the first mechanized weaving machine. And so the world's cotton came here. The world's cotton came to this place that we call home, that was at the heart of that first industrial revolution. It's why we have a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Manchester. Many of you may not know this, but we do. And we have a Lincoln Square here in Manchester. And it's because at the height of the American Civil War, I think it was 1862, if I've got my American history right here, or 3 possibly, the working men and women of Manchester took a vote, and they resolved that they would not handle slave-picked cotton. Imagine that in a city like this all those years ago. They were saying Black Lives Matter all those years ago. And it put them into great hardship in saying that, but taking that stand. But Lincoln wrote to the working men and women of Manchester after the Civil War and praised them for what he called an act of sublime Christian heroism. And he very modestly sent us a statue, which we still have to this very day. So that tells you something of the history, and it's why we're called Cottonopolis. But it's true of anything in life, isn't it? If you're the early adopter, if you're the first, sometimes you find it hard to keep first, if you like. Others will then come and overtake. And because of our reliance on textiles, but in other parts of Greater Manchester, which I represent, 3 million people across this great city region, coal was an industry, engineering, others overtook us and got better than us. Textiles went to other places. And as ever, you know, the early adopter becomes the follower eventually, or the place that's left behind. And we were, like others have said, left behind. Certainly struggled through the let's say the second half of the 20th century, and Manchester was struggling to find its place. But actually, we are at the forefront now of revitalizing the north of England. And to ask me, how have we done that? Well, if you go back in Greater Manchester's history, an earlier speaker said it, a belief in collaboration, you know, work together. And that's been very much the kind of feeling here. The boroughs of Greater Manchester co-owned the airport here going back a long time. And there's always been a belief in civic investment to bring economic prosperity. And that was a big part of keeping the various towns of Greater Manchester together. But then combined with the belief in collaboration, there's also a belief in having ambition. As I mentioned football, you know, Manchester doesn't aim to come second best in anything at all. If you ask people, what's the second city of the UK, a healthy majority of people here would tell you London. And Manchester has always been the radical outsider to London, challenging the London elite. And going back to the late 80s, Manchester famously or infamously bid to host the Olympic Games. And it was a big stretch at that time. But actually, there's something important about being ambitious and not being downtrodden as a city. And that bid in the end led to the Commonwealth Games coming to Manchester in the early 2000s. And ever since then, there's been a growing success story, a revitalization. And to bring it right up to the present, when I got elected as mayor in 2017, the vision I set was to be the UK's leading green city region and the UK's leading digital city region. Why? Because I think digitalization and decarbonisation are the two forces that will drive the 21st century economy. They are what the fourth industrial revolution is all about. I think cities like ours and like those on this call today need not to sort of cling on to dying industries. You have to get into the new and the future. And Manchester is good at bringing on the new. It always has been. And we have a science-led target now for a zero carbon Greater Manchester by 2038. And following Mayor Peduto's lead in Pittsburgh, we are very much in the business of job creation in the green economy. And we're bringing forward some ambitious plans in that direction. On digital, I'm proud to say to this gathering today that we are the fastest growing digital and tech hub in Europe. We've seen more inward foreign direct investment in digital and tech than anywhere else in Europe. We are now ahead of London in a number of aspects in the digital and tech economy, and our story is growing all the time. So I guess, we did lead the first industrial revolution. I think that's not a bold claim. I think it's probably an accepted claim. We struggled in the intervening period, but it's very much our aim now to be at the forefront of the fourth industrial revolution, and that vision is taking shape. We are a different city today. For those of you who visited, maybe you mention you remember a slightly rainy, grimy Manchester of years gone by. Well, you'd get a shock if you came here now, because in the UK, we are being called Manhattan. This is a very different Manchester with skyscrapers and a lot of modern jobs that just didn't exist here before. The BBC has a major hub here called Media City. So Manchester is changing. I think we are in pole position to benefit from the Johnson government's commitment to level up the UK. There is a recognition here now that we've been way too London-centric for far too long. And I think when people look to move out of London, they think first of Manchester, and that's to our benefit. But I think just finally, I think as we come out of the pandemic, I think Manchester's values are very much in tune with where the world wants to go. We were the home of the trade union movement here in the UK, the home of the suffragettes. I think people are looking for an economy with purpose, with fairness at its heart. I think it's no secret to say that people here in Greater Manchester were fairly electrified by President Biden's statement last week that trickle down has never worked, that we build the economy from the bottom and the middle. That is music to our ears. And we look forward very much to working with friends and colleagues in the US, in the Biden administration, fellow mayors in the US, to build an economy that has people at its heart and works for everybody. Because we haven't had that, have we, in the philosophy that kind of came through in the Thatcher-Reagan era. I think now, hopefully in this era, as we come out of this pandemic, building back better means an economy that really looks after everybody. And I've got high hopes that that's what we might now build together. But that's where we're up to, Lizzie. I will hand back to you and look forward to colleagues' questions.
Thank you so much, Mayor Burnham, and congratulations on your win over the weekend. I'm struck in listening to this how much interesting history there is in each of these cities, and not just from the kind of industrial and manufacturing history, but just I mean, as an American, hearing about histories in both of your cities outside of the United States that is really notable to our own history. But today we're talking about the future and moving forward in the changing economy. But and what occurs to me is that it doesn't happen by accident. I mean, in each of these cities, you have these cities have taken particular paths very intentionally. So I'd like to turn back to Mayor Barrett now with the question of what lessons or advice can you share with other industrial regions that are challenged by today's changing economy, and what steps they might take to deliberately pursue that future economy.
Well, I've always felt that it's important, and you've heard this, I think both mayors talked with great pride about their communities, and every community has its own identity, its own history, its own economy. And I'm a firm believer in that you play your long suit, you play to your long suit, and whatever makes you great, I think that's going to continue to make you great. That in many ways, the historic advantages that each of our communities have will continue to benefit us, although in different ways. And again, Milwaukee, as the machine shop of the world, really focused a lot on engineering, on manufacturing. And now the engineering and technical ecosystem, not just in Milwaukee, but among the Great Lakes states, is second to none. For example, in Wisconsin alone, we're graduating nearly 5,000 engineers annually. And at the same time, we're not keeping up with the growing demand for this talent. So I think for us, I can tell you one of our challenges, and I think this is true throughout certainly the Great Lakes region, is to do what we can to make sure that our educational opportunities are there for these areas where there's going to be demand. And that's why we've got a tech hub here. The Milwaukee Tech Hub is a coalition of our region's largest employers. And they want to grow our tech talent because they see where this is coming. Now, again, just to make it clear, this is not all rosy for us. One of our biggest challenges here is the racial challenge, that we don't have as many people of color who are in the pipeline for these jobs. And that is a serious problem because we have to do a better job as a region, as a community, as a metropolitan area because of the racial disparities. So that's something that's not lost on me. In fact, it's one of the things that's a priority for me, is to create more opportunities for all people in our city and in our region so that people aren't left behind. And you can see that throughout the United States, the racial disparities are causing lots of problems. And that's something I think we have to be mindful of as we pivot towards the future. But again, I think making sure that we have the people getting the right training and education, and making sure that that training and education is accessible to people from all racial and economic backgrounds.
Thank you, Mayor Barrett. I'm going to turn now to Mayor Dilkins. You talked about the Windsor Works program. How do you engage the public and manage public expectations in new initiatives like this?
Well, it's a good question. I think to build trust in the final product, we needed to be able to trust the process. And that started with selecting Public First, and they worked with a combination of national governments and cities and think tanks and charities and companies around Europe, North America, and also parts of the Middle East and Africa. So they were really focused on strategies for growth and their underlying drivers, including the skills and the talent piece, the energy and the environment, and as Mayor Burnham said, the digitization of industries. And so, the folks that we had were folks who held senior positions with the UK government, including the Office of the Prime Minister, and they brought a level of credibility that people here said, you know what, I think based on their experience, we're going to trust them. But I also think some of the actions that we took as a community previous opened the minds of people who live here to other opportunities. And so I think most of us, wherever you live, if you live in the United States or Canada, there's probably not a city or a cluster or a region that didn't apply to host Amazon's HQ2. And so from our perspective here, people were pushing politically, elected official to say, are you going to apply? And we were looking at this thinking, how the heck would we be able to support 50,000 employees in a city of 250,000 people? Like, how would you practically make this happen? But if you didn't do this, somehow you would be viewed as politically deficient. And so we said, well, what strength do we have here? What is our unique proposition in this conversation? And I called up the mayor of Detroit, Mike Duggan, had appointed Dan Gilbert, who owns the Cleveland Cavaliers and Quicken Loans and Rocket Mortgage. He had appointed Dan to be the lead for the Detroit application. And I called Dan up and I emailed him. I've never met him, never spoken to him. I sent him an email, and in about 3 hours, he got back to me. And what I said is, I think we should work together on this, that we have a strong value proposition together that would differentiate from any other application. And he was really excited about having a conversation. We got in touch and we put together a joint bid that basically talked about one campus, two countries, showed how we could have talent and buildings on both sides of the border and link the buildings with a cable car. And it was all practically possible and all entirely doable. And that way, a company like Amazon could take advantage of the best of the talent and the opportunities and the systems and structures that are in place in the United States, and the same types of structures, or the difference in the structures and the research credits that are available in Canada that may be more advantageous at some levels. And so we weren't successful, everyone knows that. But that type of work, when we stitched the document together and we created one narrative and people read it, it was really compelling for people. They saw their own region in a different way. And that really opened the door for us to be able to have other conversations and say, we need to talk about this. This is no longer something for someone in the future to worry about if and when it ever happened. We need to talk about it now. And what happened even when we weren't successful, Lizzie, is Dan Gilbert called me back and he said, you know, Drew, I'm reading our proposal. And he says, why am I not doing this with my own businesses? Like, it's so compelling. Why am I not doing this? And that led to him locating a tech office in downtown Windsor with 150 employees. And he had said to me, if I could hire 10,000 software developers, programmers, and systems engineers tomorrow, I would. I can't find them. And so why am I not taking advantage of the talent on the other side? So that's stitched in really well to the narrative that I mentioned about Windsor Works and creating pathways for homegrown talent to stay here. And that was sort of the seed that I think that I know we're trying to grow in more material ways. And Windsor Works is sort of the overarching document that gives us a structure to talk about it. The pathway is yet to come. It's still very new, only a couple of months old. So we're putting together the pieces that will lead the pathway and guide us forward to some, at the end of the day, some material improvement over the way that the community has seen themselves, thinking in the past that we weren't worthy, and now knowing that we can do this if we all row in the same direction.
Thank you, Mayor Dilkins. That is a really interesting anecdote to add to your to the story of the Windsor Works approach. I'm going to turn now to Mayor Burnham. Mayor Burnham, what can, in your experience, what can local leaders in older industrial communities do on their own? I mean, what do they need state or federal policy to help with?
I mean, there's certainly lots that in the UK context we need help with in terms of transport infrastructure investment. Well, I could give you a long list. So, you know, we're not alone as an island. We have an embryonic situation with the devolution of power to mayors in England. So there's a long way to go. However, what I would say is, I think the real power of these roles that we do, that Tom and Drew do, is that convening power to pull all society together in the city and get everyone pulling in the same direction behind something that matters. So you mobilize not just public sector, private sector, community, faith, you know, that's the real power of these roles. And I think, you know, change done that way, which is sort of inclusive bottom-up change, it's better change than top-down change that governments try and do to places. So a good example here would be homelessness. You know, we had a rising rough sleeping crisis in 2017, and I did sort of galvanize everybody around the goal of ending rough sleeping. And we have really turned the situation around. But because people have played a part in that, rather than just the government giving money to do it, I think that is a much more energizing way of doing politics. I want to pick up quickly, if I could, Lizzie, on something Tom said, because I really related to it about, you know, the need to give people the skills to take on new opportunities. And I think in cities like ours, there is sometimes a sort of legacy of people without the skills that are needed, and, you know, challenges within our communities. But I think for us anyway, it starts with a belief in our people. You know, there's an untapped resource here, is the way I see it. The country hasn't been taking advantage of the talent that's here in Greater Manchester. So you mentioned that I was in government, and I was in the Gordon Brown government just over 10 years ago. And I had the job of telling the BBC that they were moving to Salford in Greater Manchester to create Media City. And I got kind of, well, let me say, it was kind of a little bit through gritted teeth that they made this move from their ivory tower in London. You know, they were saying things like, you can't buy a latte in Greater Manchester. You can't buy the Guardian in the newspaper shops, you know, which you can, of course, but they thought that you couldn't, but you really can. So that was 10 years ago, and they couldn't see it at that time why it was in their interest, but it's been massively in their interest. Why? Because people of all backgrounds, classes, races, different accents are now on the BBC airwaves, and it is less of an ivory tower than it was. And therefore it has more legitimacy as a national broadcaster. And I compare their move here with the move recently of GCHQ, who will be well known to many people on this call, or not just to one of the UK's, the world's leading intelligence and security agencies. They have come here for our diversity, for our diverse communities. They want to tap talent from all backgrounds. They want to know all perspectives on life because of the business that they are in. And I think that's the message for me that I would want to get over. You know, we shouldn't always talk about the problems we have within our communities, the social challenges. And we do have social challenges, I'm sure, like Tom and Drew do. But actually, diversity is our strength. The fact that we've got, lots of working class communities, they are our strength as well. And they bring something. These talents haven't been tapped by the slightly elitist, London-centric British ways of the past. And I think that's what we offer in abundance. And it's why people are coming here, because any modern organization, public or private sector, I think realizes now that you have to tap the talent of all of your people, all perspectives in society, if you are to be a successful organization moving forward. And, our diversity here in Greater Manchester is a very big selling point for why people should come and invest here.
Thank you very much, Mayor Burnham. So we're going to turn now at this stage to welcoming some comments and input from others who've joined our conversation. I will be honest, we've had lots of questions popping into the chat section, but first I wanted to turn to Birgit Kloos, who is joined with us today. Birgit, are you? Yes, there you are. She steps down recently from 30 years of running Grand Rapids, Michigan's successful economic redevelopment efforts as CEO of The Right Place. And I also understand, Birgit, you are German and borrowed and built a lot from the German approach. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were doing and what worked best, in your opinion, in that time of working on economic redevelopment?
Well, thanks very much, Lizzie, and thank you. Yes, I am German. Ich bin Deutsche aus Koblenz, bin in Grand Rapids gelandet und freue mich sehr, heute hier teilnehmen zu dürfen. So I was the CEO of a private-public partnership, or 3Ps as we call them today, called The Right Place, for 33 years, serving Greater Grand Rapids. And I really appreciate participating today, particularly also in the earlier conversations on why populism, et cetera. And I could relate to many of the commentary that were made. We started the organization 35 years ago. I was the second CEO. And as I said, I served for 33 years. And really what we did is not too different what we heard from Mayor Barrett and Mayor Dilkens. And by the way, Mayor Dilkens, I'm on the International Crossing Authority for the Gordie Howe Bridge as one of the board members of the IA, along with your former mayor, Eddie Francis. Very proud to be working on a huge infrastructure project that will serve 2 countries, 2 states, and 2 great cities. So in Grand Rapids, really what we did is simple and hard. It's working together by creating a strategic plan that was renewed every 3 years. It's 80% privately funded, 20% publicly funded. And we always looked at our public sector partners as partners. And you'll be hearing tomorrow from the mayor of Grand Rapids, Rosalind Bliss. Our strategy was really not too dissimilar from what Mayor Dilkens said, except we started about 30 plus years ago. And that is look at our what do we already have? How do we build on that? How do we retain that? And how do we diversify, right? And so this has been a huge manufacturing sector for decades, but it went through serious changes in the late 70s and early 80s. But there were also companies still that we wanted to save and work with. So business retention became our key strategy. But how do we bring to that strategy what's new today and what's going to be happening tomorrow? So from just a manufacturing center, we today are a center for advanced manufacturing. We have a very fast growing information technology sector. We are a huge food processing center. And we have, over the last 25 years, built an entire industry around health and life sciences. We have research. We have a huge hospital with over 31,000 employees. Michigan State University moved its medical school to Grand Rapids, and I was heavily involved in that project. And most recently, we have our first pharma headquarters. That was my last project that came to downtown Grand Rapids. We also serve 5 rural counties. And some of the conversations that were happening earlier today, I can totally relate to when it comes to our rural versus urban strategies. And how we try to look at it is that Grand Rapids as an urban center is the front porch, and our rural communities are our backyard, and we try to make it synergistic versus butting the two against each other. So it was a great 33 years, and we're continuing on the path of diversifying, but also placemaking in the city, and you will hear that tomorrow from the mayor. We've invested hundreds of millions of dollars into making Grand Rapids a place where people want to move to.
Thank you very much, Birgit. We've got, we're going to turn now to some of the questions that have been coming in the chat. And just a reminder, if you have additional questions for the mayors or just general comments, please feel free to add them in the chat or to use the raise hand function. We've got about 20 minutes now to go through greater discussion. So, please keep that in mind. I'm going to start with a question that we've had in the chat from Marianne Sensier. How important is local finance to helping support business? In the US and Germany, the banking system is far more diverse than in the UK, with regional banks supporting local business to build resilience and weather economic shocks. Which of our mayors would like to comment? Mayor Barrett, would you like to chime in on that question?
Sure. Well, it's not unusual. They will have a project that wants to come to the city looking for help. I think that's sort of in the how to do it book, that they ask for money. Doesn't mean they always get the money. And I still remember many years ago, I was at a baseball game, and the ball boy threw a ball towards the stands. And I said to him, "Now you know what my job is like." And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, you make one person happy and you have 20 people who hate you because you threw the ball to one person, they caught it." That's a lot like incentives at the local level, at least in our neck of the woods. But I think what's far more important, and this has actually happened over the last few years, the more attractive you can make your city, the more the talent wants to be there. And it actually was a surprise to me about 10 years ago, because this is a city that saw a lot of exodus of population over 20 years. And then the younger people decided they wanted to be in the city. And all of a sudden, their employers decided, well, maybe it isn't the smartest thing in the world to be a half an hour away from the restaurants and the bars and the lakefronts and the music, that maybe there's a value to doing that. And so as we put more investments into making the heart of the city, as I call it, the heart of the city more attractive, we have attracted more businesses. The challenge sometimes is that some of the surrounding neighborhoods then, and I'm sure Drew and Andy you always experience this, one part of the city feels that they're not getting as much love and attention as the other part of the city. But one of the arguments that I've always made is, look, you have to have a strong heart. Every city has to have a strong heart. And then the rest of the body will get stronger. But by making sure that you have a strong heart, you're going to attract a lot more businesses to that area, which is going to create employment. So to me, that has been a far more effective strategy than handing out incentives. Do we look at incentives? If there's incentives, my questions are always, how many jobs are we talking about, and are they family supporting jobs? Those are the keys that we're looking for, because it's not surprising that developers or businesses are going to look for money just because. But I think the key is making the city attractive so that from a business standpoint, they know it's the right thing for them to be there.
Excellent. Mayor Dilkins, would you like to comment on the local financing question?
I probably couldn't say it better than Mayor Barrett did. I'm not sure the experience in other cities, in other countries, but there does seem to be, at least in my country, in my province, there seems to be an over-reliance on government grants to try and move projects forward. In that, there's no shortage. I think we can all agree there's no shortage of good ideas in the world. It's always the capital in order to be able to execute. And so we get a lot of folks who come to us with ideas, and they're always thinking that there's a big pot of money, but we would have the same sort of, ROI analysis that Mayor Barrett would use to say, okay, how many jobs is this going to create? And then we have different levers we can pull, but they're still fairly restrictive, that in the context of Ontario, we can, as cities, we can create community improvement plans, which allow you to do certain things, but in the absence of a community improvement plan, you cannot give a grant to an individual company. It's called bonusing here, and it's actually illegal. So we have to, as municipalities, go through the community improvement plan process, identify with precision and target certain areas in certain parts of the city that you're trying to attract different types of investment. And that allows you to be way more creative and more flexible, provided you can arrange the financing on your own end to do that. And a lot of ours comes through tax incremental financing. But I find that we're very competitive, but I would agree wholeheartedly that, you know, even if you are giving away the farm, you're going to attract a certain amount of business. At the end of the day, business wants to be in a place that is going to attract good talent, which means you have to have the amenities of a decent city that people want to live in, and then the talent will come, which will help feed the business.
I saw Mayor Burnham nodding quite a bit during your response. Anything else you'd like to add to that, Mayor Burnham?
I won't take too much time, but just to say, yeah, I fully agree with what Drew and Tom have said. I kind of feel that more financial independence is crucial to us. You know, cities are going to be the drivers of the 21st century economy, and they need to be able to move really quickly to make things happen, make change, drive change in whatever sector of the economy. And at the moment, we're in a system where we have to wait and bid to government all of the time, I think, as Drew was just kind of saying, and it's a bit draining. And, you know, more ability to move more quickly is absolutely what we've got. But we've got a financial model in this country where the City of London dominates, and it's not a very regionally diverse system. But we just have to be honest, we're not there yet. But I would like to be in a position in 10, 20 years' time where we just didn't have to wait all of the time to raise public finance or private finance, and at the moment, you know, we do, and I think that's a break on growth, to be honest. And I'd like to see a more financially independent Greater Manchester 10 or 20 years from now.
Thank you. Well, I've seen a fair amount of commentary, both public and private, in the chat about as we've raised this idea of diversity. So I wanted to turn to a question from the Consulate General. Wolfgang has added to the chat here. How much will the idea of diversity as a selling point fuel the resentment in rural areas that leads to right-wing populism? And Mayor Burnham, if we might start with you on that one.
Yeah, it's a good question, but I think it's actually the answer to some of the polarization that we've seen. You know, communities being distrustful of each other. You know, build a situation where growth is benefiting all communities, and that is the way, I would say, to break down some of that polarization. You know, people might remember I was 2 weeks in office when we had a terrible terrorist atrocity in Manchester at an Ariana Grande concert, and I'll be honest, and I bet the other mayors can relate to this, I was unsure as to how community cohesion would go, if you like, after that. But there's something real in this city, in Greater Manchester, around a belief in equality and diversity. And actually, people did the opposite. They very much came together, and that feeling is still in this city today. And I think that the risk actually is doing the opposite and not promote, you know, not seeing diversity as a strength. If you kind of pander to it as not a strength, then I think you create the conditions for much greater distrust, hate crime, and all the rest that comes with that. You've got to build an economy, I said before, that works for everybody, and you have to, in my view, respond to the fact that there is an underrepresentation of some of our communities in senior decision-making roles in both public and private sectors. But to do something about that is not to do down somebody else. And I think we've been in a kind of a decade where that's how, you know, the sort of the Trump approach to life, if I can say that, you know, was kind of built that into the narrative. And if somebody's winning, then someone else is losing. Well, it doesn't have to be like that. And I think we need to adopt a new language, and it can be done. You know, as I say, there's a genuine belief here in this place in everybody pulling together, working together, and speak to the best parts of human nature, I think. Don't pander to the worst.
Thank you, Mayor Burnham. I'd like to turn to Jürgen Hein, who's got his hand raised to ask a question.
Yes, thank you very much, Lizzie. This question goes mainly to Mayor Burnham, because we in the rural area have one concern, and I would like to know how this is going on in Greater Manchester. Is the progress that we are making actually for the people who are there? Or is it a progress connected with gentrification? Is it for people who move in? Is it for the successful? And those who lost are still losing out? Thank you.
Shall I take that, Lizzie? I mean, it's a really profound question, actually. And I think cities need to be wary of this, even cities that perhaps have been, former industrial cities as they change. There can be a gentrification. And I think, I mentioned Manhattan before. I think many of the young people growing up around this amazing city of ours now, the young people don't imagine themselves working in the skyscrapers that have sprung up in Manchester city centre. If I'm honest, they see it as other people having come in here and been relocated. So the next chapter in Greater Manchester's history, and I'm acutely conscious of this, is to build a belief in our young people as they grow up and as they look at these amazing buildings, that they can work there, that their future will be there. And I'm just going to be brutally honest with you, Jürgen, and say I don't think we are at that point at this moment in time, but we've got to get to that point. So I've done lots to give young people free travel across Greater Manchester. I'm constantly saying we believe in you. You are our strength. And I think that is the challenge. 30 years ago, I graduated from Cambridge University. I came back to Manchester because I wanted to work in Manchester, and having sent probably thousands of CVs around the city, I gave up and moved to London. And it's been a long truth in this country that if you want to get on in life, you have to move south. And Greater Manchester will only really fulfill its potential when that is no longer true. When you grow up here, but it's the people who grow up here go to those new jobs in Media City, Salford, or go into the jobs at GCHQ in city centre Manchester. That is the next chapter for Greater Manchester, and we are not quite there yet. And it sounds as though you have something of the same phenomenon in your part of the world, which has very many similarities to ours. So yeah, I completely see where you're coming from, and I spend so much of my time talking to the next generation. I said when I left Westminster politics that I was going to stop doing what Westminster does, which often makes young people the target for cuts when spending cuts are being made. I said we're going to use devolution of power to Greater Manchester to make young people the priority for investment. And we really have worked quite hard at that. And I think any city needs to speak to its young people, really does. Any mayor, I think, really needs to speak to the young people all of the time, building them up, lifting their sights, opening the doors for them. And for me, we're not there yet, but that's very much where I want to go.
Lizzie,
thank you very much. Oh, yes, please, Mayor Barrett.
I think both of these questions really go to the heart of at least the experience that I have. I think that Wolfgang's reference to rural areas and, in essence, right-wing populism, it is a fear, whether it's in the United States or immigrants in Germany or wherever. And I think those politicians that rely on it, I've always sort of pictured our society as a ladder, with economic rungs on the ladder. And I think in life, if you're on a ladder, the person you're most afraid of and the person you're most interested in passing is the person one rung below you on the ladder and one rung above you on the ladder. You really don't care about those individuals who are 20 rungs above you or 20 rungs behind you. But I think some of the, from my standpoint, evil genius of right-wing populism is to make people who are right adjacent to each other on that ladder hate or distrust each other, when actually they probably have more in common economically. And that's an issue that we face, because you're right, as we try to have more opportunities for diversity here in the metropolitan area of Milwaukee, there is antipathy towards us from some rural areas, and certainly from rural politicians. At the same time, Young's question on gentrification, we just had an announcement this last week of the largest influx of jobs from the suburbs to the city in the history of the city. And I thought it was going to be a slam dunk because it's the largest influx of jobs. We ultimately got it passed, but there was a long, long conversation about what it would do for the people at the very lowest end of the economic scale, the janitors, the food servers. Are we creating opportunities for them? And that ties into the gentrification. Who are we creating these jobs for? And so that's the tightrope I think mayors walk, is we want to have these jobs in our cities. Every one of us wants to have the jobs in our cities, but we also want everybody to benefit from it. And so that's why none of us are bored, because that's always the real world challenge that we have, at least from my experience. I don't know if Drew and Andy have the same experience.
Mayor Dilkens, do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, you know, really well put, Mayor Barrett. And I think that, you know, Canada, especially in the last 5 years or so, has had a very robust policy on immigration. And when times were a little tougher here, when the economy wasn't as robust as it is today, there was a little more fear about immigration and what it would mean. But at the same time, at a federal level, they have those policies. They also fund very well, I would submit, the settlement process. And so people are integrated really, really well when they get here. And I think, I'm 49 years old. If I think the time I graduated high school, my high school was probably 95% white faces and maybe 98% and 2% faces of color. It's exactly the opposite today. The city has changed that dramatically in the course of, say, 30 years. But at the same time, it's really made the city much richer. And it hasn't been without growing pains. It hasn't been without its set of challenges. And it's still, the discomfort still raises its head from time to time. And I think of even right now, I think it's tomorrow or the 13th is the end of Ramadan. And so because we're in lockdown here in Ontario, last year, the local mosque asked whether they could, well, there's many local mosques, but the association asked whether they could play the call to prayer for 2 minutes. And we were in lockdown at this time last year as well. And the vitriol from some, when council approved that, played out. This year, we're in lockdown again at the same time. Council unanimously approved allowing this to happen. Didn't hear one thing this year. And so either the people gave up or they just realized, okay, it really wasn't, I was fearful of something that there was no reason to have fear for. And so that it's still there. There's a little bit of an undercurrent, but I find every day it gets better and better as people become a little more understanding of their neighbors and the people who live down the road and the people that they interact with. But I think the community is far more robust today, 30 years on, than it was 30 years ago, and better restaurants, by the way.
All right, thank you. We're getting towards the end of well, soon, just a few minutes away from our closing remarks. And I want to take an opportunity and liberty as the moderator of this discussion to take a question that we have from Andra from the London Economic, which is directed to Mayor Burnham. And I want to kind of wrap that into a concluding question for each of our mayors before final remarks. But Andra has asked for Mayor Burnham, do you think investment in industrial areas could drive a movement to rejoin the EU? And more generally, do you think industrial regions in the UK have been abandoned? Now, that's a question for Mayor Burnham, but a question I'd like to pose to each of our other mayors is, when you hear people talk about the industrial regions being abandoned, what is your response to that, whether from kind of the federal level, the public level, or more at the local level? So Mayor Burnham, we'll start with you.
Well, certainly I agree that they were abandoned here. I'm afraid, the 80s were grim in this part of the UK, where the traditional industry left, and there seemed to be a view that we could fund the whole country via the City of London and the service economy, and that's been really difficult, and where I think we're only kind of emerging out of it now. So definitely, I mean, I was in the Blair government, I was in the Brown government, I was in the Labour front bench in Parliament. I repeatedly said to my own party, and it pains me again to admit this, but Labour itself was too London-centric. British politics is too London-centric. And it's kind of been the kind of dominant thing that's been at the center of it all for too long. You know, the Westminster political system has created the North-South divide in the UK. And yes, those communities were absolutely abandoned. And now we have a government saying it wants to level up the UK. So we will see. But, you know, it's a big job, this, because it's still the case that, you know, simple things like public transport cost so much more in my city than they do in London. I mean, how can that possibly be right? It's because London got a mayor 20 years ago and all the governments have funded London and the Olympics and all of those things, you know. We're a very uneven country, a very, very uneven country. In fact, we are the most politically over-centralized country in the OECD, with all power pretty much vested in Westminster, but also the most regionally unbalanced. One of the most regional unbalanced. And I think those two things are connected. You know, if you put all of the political power in one place, it tends to benefit that place more than it does everywhere else. So do we, as we revive, do we want to rejoin the EU? Well, to be honest, that argument is settled here now. You know, I think we are drawing a line. And, you know, there was a by-election in the UK last week wherein a place that voted to leave the EU, you know, I think they are very much sort of having switched from the Labour Party perceived to want to stay in the EU as was, you know, and people are embracing the fact that this is a new reality now in the UK. And I think that's the way everybody needs to embrace it. We're in a new reality. But the way that we will approach things is to be true to Manchester's international perspective on life. It's European roots. You know, we want to carry on working with our partners and find a way of making Brexit work for our communities. But I think the one thing that Brexit has done, it has actually exposed this wide divide in the UK between the different regions. And it has broken out this issue of regional inequality. And now the Johnson government's wish to level up. I'm skeptical about whether they will actually follow through on it. But that's the debate now in the UK. That is number one, if you like, on the political agenda. And in all of my life, you know, having spoken up for the North of England in Parliament, I've never seen regional inequality as the top issue in British politics, but now it is the top issue. And I think it's more of an internal debate that's going to go on in this country now about how do we get regional equality, rather than everyone talking about how quickly can we rejoin the EU. Well, that's gone, I'm afraid, for now, and maybe forever, I don't know. Now it's about how does this union of the UK hold together? Because this union could break down with the things that are happening in Scotland. So I think it's more about staying in the union we're still in, the United Kingdom, and making that United Kingdom more equal across all of its nations and regions. That is where the UK is right now.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Mayor Barrett. Any thoughts on the idea, what your reaction is when you hear that people are, when you hear of the idea that industrial regions and industrial areas have been left behind or abandoned?
Everybody loves the underdog, and I think all of us have a natural resentment to the big guy. And so whether it's Manchester towards London, whether it's in the United States towards Washington, D.C., or here in the Midwest, Chicago's the big one. And I always refer to Chicago very affectionately as one of our finest suburbs, lying 90 miles to the north of there. But in Wisconsin, Milwaukee's the bad guy. And we're the industrial center, but we're viewed as the bad guy oftentimes. But what has changed pretty dramatically over the last 20 years is there was a point 20 years ago where we were receiving more money from the state than we were contributing through taxes and things like that. Because of the success we've had in creating and retaining jobs in the city, we are now a donor to the state. But that antipathy towards us has not gone away. And if anything, it's gotten worse. So you have this, and this goes to Wolfgang's question, I think, about the rural areas feeling left behind, that because they're not doing as well, somehow it's our fault. And I think Andy's point is, as political leaders, whether we're local leaders or state leaders or province leaders or national leaders, our obligation is to try to make sure that we're treating all of our children fairly, and that we have a society, and this is where the racial inequities come in and the rural-urban divide comes in, where we do create these opportunities. And that's a challenge. That is a challenge that we all recognize is real. And I think even on this phone call or on the Zoom call, all of us now feel like we're experts on Zoom because we've been doing this for 14 months. But the genius is whoever created this thing, I want that person to be living in Milwaukee. And I'm sure Andy wants that person to be living in Manchester, and Drew wants that person to be in Windsor. Those are the people that we have to find more of those people and create more of those people.
Thank you. Ambassador Dilkens, our industrial regions left behind.
And the person who created Zoom is on a mega yacht somewhere in St. Bart's right now, I'm sure. I would say that, from a Canadian perspective here, that things ebb and flow. And what I mean by that is I think everyone has a tacit appreciation and understanding of the value of manufacturing and automotive, if I put my automotive hat on. People get it and they know it's an important part of the economy, and there's a lot of well-paying jobs that are created, not just directly in the OEMs, but also the entire supply chains, and it feeds a lot of families here. But what happens is, and we really saw this play out in the last decade, where all eyes were on Alberta and the production of oil and the oil sands, and they got all the attention, and it was a huge part of the resourcing there was a huge part of the economy. And then guess what? All of a sudden the price of oil went up and it became unaffordable to mine or to process tar sand. And basically that stopped almost overnight. I mean, it felt like almost overnight. And all of a sudden, the spotlight came back to Ontario, the manufacturing heartland of Canada, and there was a great emphasis placed on manufacturing. But I would say that the response is, if Chrysler, if Ford, if General Motors say they want to make a new investment and it's going to be $1 billion or $2 billion, all of a sudden there's someone from government there to write a check and to help get it across the finish line. And the pictures look great and everyone's happy because there's going to be 5 to 10 more years of prosperity in those particular communities. What we haven't seen is a defined strategy about where we want to go so that it gets prominence, it gets funding, it's resourced properly, and that eventually we're there and we're not sort of chasing the next shiny penny all the time. And so I've started to see that play out in terms of electrification of vehicles, in terms of battery production. I think our governments are starting to get serious now on what that means and trying to get a piece of the pie early enough, because they realize if you're in the market, if you're in the game, if you're an early adopter, and perhaps we're not even early adopters, but probably close to being, you're still on the leading edge here, that there is going to be further value for a longer period of time if you play your cards right now. And so I'm buoyed by what I see happening now, but it's not always been this way in Canada, at least during my sort of aware life.
Thank you very much. And as we reach the very end of our panel here today, I want to invite each of our mayors to leave us with one final thought. If our audience remembers one thing about your city and how it has faced the challenges of a changing economy, what would you want that to be? We will start with Mayor Barrett.
Well, Laverne and Shirley don't work here anymore. And as proud as we are that they were here, along with Fonzie and others, this city has changed. And the one constant with all cities is we're always changing. We're always evolving. And here we are on America's fresh coast, and we have opportunities here. And this is an affordable city. It's a city that embraces newcomers and new investment. And we want everybody to remember that. So thank you, Lizzie, and thank you to my fellow mayors very, very much. I've enjoyed this immensely.
Thank you very much. Mayor Dilkens.
Well, thanks, Lizzie, and I echo Mayor Barrett. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone today. And I would just leave you with the thought that Windsor is moving from being a big, small city to becoming a small, big city. And that mindset shift is fundamental to our future success. And we're going to play in and lean in on the diversity that we have here. We're going to lean in on the expertise that we've built for the last century and 128 years. And I'm really excited about what I see happening here in the interplay of the relationship with Detroit and Windsor, and being able to build on some of the excitement that's happening across the river, and playing into that here in our community and leveraging those opportunities to create a better future for the kids that are getting into school and graduating tomorrow.
Thank you. And Mayor Burnham.
Well, what can I say? I mean, we are the city of the Smiths, so we gave the world Morrissey. And I think maybe that contributes to this thing that, oh, woe is us, and oh, we're all so miserable here, and it rains a lot, and you know, that's maybe what people think of about Manchester. And I think lots of countries have a Manchester. Everyone always tells me, oh, this city's called the Manchester of Japan. And I think in Finland, they've got a Manchester of Finland. You've got a Manchester in the US, of course. So we're kind of seen in that sort of backward looking way. But the thing I want to leave you with is, you know, we're at the forefront of the new UK. This city is absolutely in pole position to build the new rebalanced United Kingdom. And we don't just have one world leading football club. We have two now, Manchester City and Manchester United. We, as I say, we don't aim to be second best in anything. And we are very much a collaborator, though. We are a cooperator and a collaborator. And it's why I join calls like this. It's wonderful to be with Tom and Drew and everyone on this call. I think networking cities around the world is the future, looking beyond our own city boundaries, getting us all together, sharing ideas like this, that's the future. And in Manchester, you've got an open, collaborative partner, and we look forward to working with you all through the COP in Glasgow later this year, but beyond. So thank you, Lizzie, thanks for having us with you today.
Well, thanks to our distinguished panelists. I thought this was a wonderful conversation. I'm really happy that I got to be a part of it. And thank you to our audience for joining us as well. With that, I will pass it back over to Brian.
Terrific. Thank you, Lizzie, and thank you to the mayors. That was indeed a fabulous conversation. And as been pointed out many times over the course of the day, the energy and innovation that's coming out of cities and leadership is really important in addressing this set of challenges and creating opportunities. And I think that was very much on display in this discussion with the mayors. So there are two more things yet for today. One is that we're going to close the formal remarks with a message from Congressman Andy Levin. I'll introduce in just a second. But I do want to say that after the Congressman's remarks, we are going to have an opportunity for breakout rooms in which you're going to be able to self-select and actually meet and talk to the people who are on this call that you've been seeing in little boxes all day. So I know it's late in Europe, but I encourage people to stick around, because one of the things that we want to do through this whole process is to create some new connections. We just talked about the new connections and ideas exchange. So we hope you'll stay for that. So let me introduce Congressman Andy Levin, who's a fascinating person, represents Michigan's 9th district, which includes the communities of Macomb and Oakland, which are counties, which are just out. Levin has a really fascinating career and set of perspectives. He has been a union organizer. He has been a workforce policy expert at both the national level as well as the state level in Michigan. He's worked on green jobs initiatives, and he's also been a green energy entrepreneur. And let's listen to his thoughts for today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today. It's an honor to join leaders from the US, Canada, and Western Europe to discuss the importance of revitalizing industrial regions on both sides of the Atlantic. I represent Macomb and Oakland counties in Southeast Michigan. We have a shared history with regions in France, Germany, the UK, and elsewhere. Many people here have been left behind by half a century of trade and labor policies that have valued bottom lines over community well-being. This is an all too common story in the industry-heavy parts of Western democracies. Economic turmoil has increased mistrust of traditional parties and leaders and government itself. As all of our countries have seen, the ensuing political instability is a breeding ground for demagogues who promise easy fixes, and they blame vulnerable minority populations for systemic problems. This is a moment for policymakers to offer bold solutions to the massive problems facing our societies. We need to unrig the rules that have enriched the ultra-wealthy and corporations at the expense of working people. We need to pass legislation like the Protecting the Right to Organize, or PRO Act here in the United States, so that working people can bargain collectively for better wages, better working conditions, and a better life for their families. Fortunately, there's great work already happening at the state and local level here in the United States. Before I came to Congress, I ran Michigan's Department of Energy, Labor, and Economic Growth during the Great Recession and right before. At the time, the collapse of the big three US automakers, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, now called Stellantis, seemed imminent, and Michigan's heavy industrial workforce was facing a true catastrophe. I created a program called No Worker Left Behind that helped 162,000 un- and underemployed workers go back to school at no cost in order to launch themselves into new career opportunities. They took jobs in advanced manufacturing, in IT, in robotics, most of all in healthcare. When I proposed the program, I ran into concerns like this. People said, people won't want to go back to school. We work with our hands. Workers won't want to learn new skills. What happened really on the ground? We had waiting lists in every one of Michigan's 83 counties. We blew away our boldest uptake projections. No Worker Left Behind proved that in industrial regions like Michigan, people are ready and willing to learn a new skill for an in-demand job, if we only give them the chance. I believe people across the country and across the Atlantic share the same drive to participate in the new economy and to provide proudly for their families. Just imagine harnessing that hardworking spirit in the name of a clean energy revolution that not only saves the planet, but leads to dignified, safe work with strong labor provisions. Once we're taking care of the workers most affected by the shift to green energy, we can turn our attention to the market. You know, there's a tendency in one political party in the United States to pit strong governmental standards and programs to tackle climate change against a thriving capitalist economy. Just like the concerns that workers wouldn't want to go back to school, this line of argument does not square with the actual facts on the ground. After my time at the state of Michigan, I started Lean and Green Michigan, a company to help finance clean energy transitions by businesses and nonprofits. They basically did radical energy makeovers of their buildings. When I came to Congress, I separated myself from Lean and Green Michigan, but I'm proud to say that today, 71% of Michiganders live in an area that is participating in that program. It depended almost completely on market participants seeking to make money, property owners seeking to reduce their energy costs, clean energy contractors looking to deploy that solar, that wind, that geothermal, put in a new boiler or chiller, put in tinted windows, whatever that company needed, and lenders seeking to make money by providing the capital. How much more opportunity could we create by setting clear dates by which new buildings need to be zero net energy, by which vehicles need to be zero emissions, and on and on? I believe that if we remain technology agnostic and we remain flexible, we'll watch the market meet and beat those deadlines that we set in order to save life on Earth as we know it. We face great challenges from the recent political, economic, and public health crises that have racked our respective nations. Perhaps the greatest challenge facing our children is one they're not responsible for, that have been created by we, their parents and their grandparents. Climate change. It looms over all of us, but there's still time to act. We must not shy away from these challenges, and we definitely must not cede ground to the demagogues who seek to divide us. The only way we can defeat white supremacy, preserve our democracies, and save our precious Earth is to invest in workers and create an economy that works for everyone. Thanks again so much for having me, and have a great rest of the conference.